The thunderbolt was near the estate, wrapping everything around with his power. Everyone rejoices in the long-awaited birth, and immediately start to say that the crystal should be brought as soon as possible. This system works as follows. The color of the crystal indicates what gift the newborn is endowed, what a nanny holds on her hands. The nanny leads a cart with crystal. The father of the child proudly announces that he is the second child of the Lukewood family, and he is convinced that their child is endowed with great power. The mother is silent, trying to come to mind after childbirth. The maid lifts the baby's handle to the crystal, and everyone gather around to see what happens. The parents of the baby could not believe their eyes. It seemed impossible for them. From the very beginning, our hero was called Khayyam Zeniti. After leaving school, he was able to settle in a well-known enterprise with successful oil refining complexes. Although it does not matter to him, our hero feels like in paradise. Before him is a guy with long hair and apologizes because he believes that Khayyam was not born in that world. The protagonist was in this situation because he died while saving the child from the car. To his great surprise, the boy was a god standing before him in heaven. The guy continued the conversation and noted that by this point, the main character only pulled his existence in an unsuitable and hostile world. He tells them that Khayyam will go to a world where, in fact, he was to be born at first. God assures that this world will come to him, so he must like the main character. But when he heard this, Khayyam only frozen in the design, not answering a single word. This is how the second life of Kias began, full of hope in this new world. However, after reincarnation into another world and into a new family, when his hand touched the sphere, she became completely black. The father of the family could not believe that their kind could be born a descendant with a black crystal. The maids were shocked. They could not believe that the infant had an attribute of darkness. The mother asked how a demonic baby could be born in their family. The protagonist lies in the cradle as soon as she is in a new life. However, he is not yet aware of the horror that has swept everyone around. He thinks whether they really hint that he is a child of demons. The father of the family with a loud indignation stated that this baby would be a black spot on their family tree, and assured that the main character should not be born at all. His wife tries to reassure him, reminding that they also have a second son named Leo, whom she now gently holds. After that, she offers her husband to pretend that the protagonist died at birth. Kilima shudders with fear, thinking if they are really aimed at killing it. The family's father placed a newborn baby somewhere, and the protagonist was concerned only why this world was much worse than the one in which he lived earlier. After a while, Khayyam opens his eyes and hesitates whether he really sees light in front of himself. The next one that appears before his eyes is the smiling faces of a man and women who look at him inseparable. A man and a woman have a conversation, paying attention to the insightful look of the main character. They ask him to notice his new home, which is just behind them. However, Kiwi does not leave intrusive questions. Who are these people who stand in front of him, and where did he end? But a little later, he begins to guess that he was probably taken out of the house under the cover of the night. As it turned out, the main character was adopted by his uncle. The realization that he is still alive so felt it that tears of happiness flowed from his eyes. It caused anxiety with uncle and aunt, while his wife decided that the hero had simply suffered a marine illness all night in a carriage, and therefore heard bad. Without hearing a minute, she embraces the baby to herself, gently hugs and assures that from now on, everything will be fine, and he has nothing to worry about. These words bring the reassurance of Khayyam, and then he begins to closely monitor his aunt. The boy's uncle says that, in addition to everything, the sun was finally though yesterday it was pouring out of a bucket. As if the sun rejoiced in the appearance of this newborn. But well, the husband still decides to ask his wife. She does not dispute the name of the Kyle. The woman, continuing to keep his main character in the arms, is interested in details. The husband explains to her that he wants to be called so, because in his ancient language it means sun, but his wife is not quite sure. A man pleased with her fiction asks if she likes that name and whether he has come up with it. The child directed a direct look at the sun. Parents watched the baby closely, admiring his radiant joy. He really liked the name he chose, because it meant the sun, which instantly caused a smile on his face. It is said that from now on, this place will become his home. Thus, the life of the protagonist begins a new section in a new family. It has been 5 years, and Kyla is called to gather faster, because it's time to go. The protagonist calmly comes out of the estate, answering what he is right, and turns to her, calling his mother. In this world, his name is Kyle Flylefield. The couple sits in a carriage. The man clarifies whether everyone took everything. This is Flyfield's couple. The man is Demio, and his wife is Glue. The boy rushes to his parents in a carriage because they are going on a trip again. But before sitting in a carriage, the protagonist turns to Alan and Max. He expresses hope for their support while smiling sincerely. Knights raise their hands, demonstrating that they understood the boy, because these two will accompany him. Demiro Flyfield from the window turns to his servants and butler, expressing hope for their devotion. He asks them to carefully monitor the house in his absence. In response, the servant worships him respectfully. This year he turned 5. Inspiration Adhesive reports that it is very pleased with this trip because Eris has not visited for a long time. The boy's father tells him that from there, where they go, a wonderful landscape on the sea opens, and offers to look at him together. The guy replies, his face blossoms with a smile. And from the night when the main character was born in this world again, he lived a completely happy life, surrounded by the care of loving parents. However, of course, he did not think to forget about the night when the crystal became absolutely black from its touch. That is why Kyle decided to explore this world deeper and learn more about the magic that exists in it. After completing his studies, he found out that magic in this world is divided into 8 attributes: earth, water, fire, wind, ice, lightning, darkness, and light. However, from birth, everyone can possess only one of these attributes. It is possible to determine what magic a person has with the help of a crystal that changes color when touched. Blue symbolizes water, red points to fire, and so on. Usually, the ability to a certain element is detected immediately after birth, and this largely shapes the future fate of the individual. The crystal of the main character suddenly became black. This can only mean one thing: its attribute is darkness. Or more precisely, it is a property inherent in demons. When the guy read carefully in the information on the pages of the book, he invisibly enveloped the sadness. Then his foster mother said that he should not worry about the color of his skin. These words were so surprised by Kyle that he finally realized these people knew everything from the beginning, and yet they managed to hide him. While the hero was riding in the crew to Aris, he plunged into a deep reflection on the surviving for these 5 years and about those who gave him shelter. The foster father noticed the tense expression of the boy's face and decided to ask that he was concerned, because he looked immersed in deep reflections. It was quite surprised by Kyle, because he did not expect such insightful remarks from her husband. The boy's father wondered if he was planning his actions to arrive at the destination. Exhaled with relief because his thoughts remained hidden, the guy just agreed to become a father. Still, he feels embarrassed that this infamous evening is again in memory. However, now he really feels absolute happiness and nothing stands in his way. He recalls the words of God, who emphasized that the protagonist should enjoy his new life. Kyle simply expresses his gratitude for it. After a while, they had already crossed part of the road. The man reports that they will have to go through the forest. It seems that he also shows anxiety. He then asks Kyle whether he worries, what he nods to. However, the protagonist can still not comprehend what is happening at this moment. In the end, as soon as they stepped into the forest, he immediately felt that something was wrong here. It seems to him that something ominous is waiting for him. Suddenly, he realizes something important for himself. Kyle suddenly appeals to his foster father to stop the carriage immediately. He cannot understand what the problem is and what happened to Kale. The boy explains to him that the road they go will intersect the power of a lot of monsters. The father does not stop what other monsters could appear. Then he reassures his son, assuring that all is keeping the situation under control from the front line, and as soon as he returns, the guy will be able to make sure that everything is fine. He said Max that they should find a new way as soon as possible. To hear the crazy roar of the monsters ahead, and Max, stunned by this, asked Ela if he was convinced of his decision. Kyle's mother asks her son where he learned about it. But in his thoughts, only paintings on the monster attack. He immediately rushes to leaving the wagon, but stops for a moment, hearing his father's voice. Kyle turned to him and explained that the monsters had attacked someone, which is why he had to intervene. Parents cannot believe in what they heard and sharply jump out of chairs. The father does not understand what the boy says. The mother, on the contrary, tries to return the main character to the place, asking him to sit. He does not obey them and apologizes for his behavior, explaining that he has long read all the books about magic and has long been able to spell. However, nothing can be done. His parents remain in a carriage. Catching in a barrier-created barrier, the soldier silently is confused. He simply cannot believe his eyes. A wind barrier appeared in front of him. A moment later, The main character apologizes from Allah and directs his magic to him, more precisely, balloons. The warrior does not have time to dodge on time, and therefore finds himself on the ground, leaving his horse without a rider. This is what Kyle sought. Hardly holding back joy, he immediately jumps on a horse. He appeals to his parents in the carriage and to Ela, who fell from the horse, asking to stay still and not move. Subsequently, he appeals to his foster parents with a sincere request for forgiveness, explaining that he simply cannot leave people for a brush. Parents, getting out of the carriage, try to stop it, but their efforts are in vain. The protagonist deeply understands that they are feeling now. In this life, his parents have already renounced him, and even in such a situation there were people ready to give shelter to those who could be a demon. That's why he will never leave them. After that, the hero moves the horse, galloping even faster and more decisively to save people. At the time, at the place where the monster was attacked, the knight warns its companions to stay in certain places and protect the carriage behind them at any cost, regardless of the circumstances. And yet he cannot understand how that could happen. How could they confront not only ordinary goblins, but also sorcerers among them, wild wolves, and even orc? In addition, according to his estimates, there were only 3 of them. He still cannot understand how it happened that they jumped on all these monsters during the accompaniment of a young lady. The girl only watched them from the windows of the crew, and the knight ordered her comrades to restrain the monsters and prevent the breakthrough. The goblins of the head are attacking the knights. They have called for horror, unable to move out of place. Wild wolves confidently took a course on a carriage. The commander began to hesitate whether their purpose was a carriage, because the wolves surrounded them while the captain was fighting. It comes to the realization, in such conditions, not last long. Suddenly, someone speaks a spell called Window. It directs directly to the target, destroying the orc with all around the impressive explosion, which is mourning as if it were thunder. The captain looks closely at the man he did. It was Kyle who suddenly appeared on horseback. He smiled strangely, feeling the pleasure of having enough strength for such a powerful blow. This was the first time he tested him on the enemies. All the knights froze in surprise, stunned by the fact that this boy has the magic of the wind. The captain, too, could not come to mind with surprise, refusing to believe his eyes, because only a child stood in front of him. Subsequently, Kyle rushes from the horse and goes to the ground, asking her to leave. The blow awakened the anger of the monster. They again approach the carriage where the knights were with the boy. The captain is aware that the situation is extremely dangerous because they are trapped by monsters. Having thought deeply, the protagonist turned sharply to the knights and advised them to move everyone faster to the carriage. They were amazed at the heart of the boy heard. And when several people expressed their doubts, the commander of their detachment boldly intervened and ominously ordered the guy's instructions. The protagonist used magic called the Wall of Light. This powerful lounge created an insurmountable barrier around the carriage, which reliably protected them from the attack of the monster and did not allow them to do any harm. Monsters only attack the barrier. The captain cannot believe that it is really light magic, because recently the guy used exclusively the magic of the wind. Meanwhile, Kyo, rolling his sleeves, felt pleasure in his own determination and noted that he was now ready to go on the road. Both monsters and knights looked at him confusedly, not understanding what to expect from him. However, the protagonist made it clear that despite everything, he is not going to waste his valuable time on them. As soon as he ran, he raised his hand to heaven and used a spell called Rain Call. The captain watches him, not believing his eyes. Does he really impose a spell of water? He thinks of how many elements the main character has. The monsters are also covered with horror, but only through the thick clouds that accumulate over them. Kyle waves his hand again before the crowd of monsters approaches. He says goodbye to everyone, raises his hand and skillfully performs a spell called Electric Rain. All the monsters flare up the flames, and in a moment, they only remain aphid. The members of the Knight Order watched him with great interest and could not realize whether he really was able to combine the magic of lightning water. With his erased forehead, Kyle feels relief. It finally ended. And the captain still broke his head, trying to understand who this mysterious hero is and where he had such extraordinary abilities. Going past the body of the monsters, Kyle decided that it would be best to pick them up to the Shadow Repository, because leaving these carcasses in the middle of the road is not the best idea. The captain did not stop wondering that Kyle has the magic of darkness. However, he still cannot understand who this guy really is. He, in turn, stops in front of the captain and states that his task is completed, asking them to protect himself. Then he just waves them for goodbye, but the commander still asks him to stay. He shouts loudly, asking to wait at least a minute. The young woman who was sitting in a carriage throughout this time is carefully looking at the departing Kyle. She thinks of who he really was. The ghost hero rushes to his family. Young lady, having lost him from sight, realizes that he still left her. Once, when he returned to his parents, he saw an upset owl, angry father, and a burnt mother. He just looked at them silently without saying a single word. Later, he decided to find out if they were really angry with him. The father replied that of course they were angry. The mother added that during his absence she could not find a place. After that, AL joined the conversation, noting that, of course, they were very pleased that Kyle was safe, but asked him not to forget that their duty was to protect him. Max, having saddled his horse, notes Alavi that he is wrong, but his friend cannot understand what his flaw is. Max told him that when he followed the young gentleman, an incredible picture opened before him. If it were not our main character, they would all be doomed under the pressure of that invasion of monsters. After heard in the crowd, shock prevailed, and he added that the young master with his magic of wind, water, and zippers did not leave the monsters of any chance of salvation. The father simply cannot believe that his son has the magic of wind, water, and zippers. He rejects such an opinion as absolute nonsense. After all, the crystal showed that the main character is characterized by darkness, but gradually doubts begin to turn into his soul. He decided to clarify in Carl whether he understood everything correctly. The guy was a little ashamed, but assured that he outlined everything. Then he promised his parents to tell the details at home. He will tell them about his strength and crystal. Philofield's family head was in a state of horror after the protagonist's story, remaining in full misunderstanding. The mother-in-law was no less stunned. She instinctively pressed her hand to her mouth to hide her surprise. Even the knights, who were always distinguished by courage, stood silently, unable to extract a single word. Soon he somehow clumsily scratching his head, throwing his hand behind the nape, and suggested that they discuss it later, noting that it was better to return home first. After a while, Frelafield's training platform. The main character sweeps past a maid who holds a tray in his hands and smiles soap. Then he begins an explanation of magic for his foster parents. Therefore, he asks them to imagine that this ball from the water is a magic crystal. Having taken the bag from the tray, Kyle solved the rope and poured all its contents in this sphere. He explained to the audience that it was the property of water, to which he added a blue tint. His parents began to look closely at what was happening. The father tweaked the glasses to miss anything, and noticed how the water became crystal blue. The mother could not restrain the surprise from what he saw. The protagonist continued to explain everything to those present, holding other packages with mysterious things, and only added that he would now complement everything else. Starting to release the contents of each ring, he spoke that red symbolizes fire, brown, the earth, green, the wind, blue, ice, and purple, lightning. The father, unable to withstand the pace, asked his son to stay for at least a minute. He asked him why he decided to add all the elements. Because Max had previously told them that the protagonist could only control the wind, water, and lightness. His wife was relieved that Kyle can only use these 3 elements. The guy in response silently lifts his hand compressed into his fist to his lips. In a moment he opens it. From there, 5 magical elements appeared before your look, and only the protagonist could explain what happened to them. As his foster father, he already guessed everything and asked if he really had 5 magical attributes. Kyle tasted him a little and noted that both light and darkness should be taken into account. After that, he clearly demonstrated them using the other hand. After that, he began to explain that when mixed white and black, both parents were so impressed with his words that they could barely believe in what he was heard. The adopter of the boy decided to clarify. Will the water ball be completely black when all the attributes are mixed? The guy confirmed his assumption. He said that when he was born and touched this glass crystal, the same thing happened. That is why the crystal changed its color to black, darkness. When his father went into thought, his mother only stood, stunned by disbelief. Then the head of the Fleer family, with a serious expression of the face, expressed his understanding of the situation. He confirmed that he has all the necessary features, but he captures something more. And when did the main character realize all this? Kyle did not bother this question. He noted that it was very simple, and said that he came across one extremely interesting book in his foster father's library. The man was naked for a moment, and then asked if it was his work. The protagonist gladly agreed and added that he just took this book and studied for it, doing nothing special. Then he lifted this book, still holding it in his hands. The family's father from the flea field recognized her and noted that it was Tom Rizak. However, the guy did not understand what his father meant. Setting the glasses, the man only noted that now everything was clear to him, because his old friend is his long time. Tyle could not believe this news, so he asked his father if it was true. Then he added that it was wonderful. The father just smiled widely, making it clear to his son that he understood everything correctly. And the mother, standing next to her husband, also did not hold her smiles, and, clumsily rubbing her neck, noted that it causes memories. The guy also blurs in a bright, warm smile, gladly looking at a book that he firmly presses against himself. He notes that this book is great for beginners. It gives comprehensive explanations, and for enthusiastic fans opens the way to skillful improvement. My father listened to his son carefully, noting that his words became a wonderful review of this book, and he would be pleased to hear them as well. However, his reflections interrupted the arrival of the maid with the news of the guest's arrival, and the man wondered who could arrive at that time. As soon as they left the estate, a man arose. It seemed as if he had already heard their conversation and immediately answered the unknown question: who could be it? The stranger only noted that he was his longtime friend. However, the girl in the hat noticed that the head of the flea family looked as if he did not want to see guests at all. She notes that it is quite impolite on his part, asking if he really feels so. As the man approached the visitor, he recognized her instantly, and the expression of his face has changed strikingly. He said that this face was familiar to him. The protagonist also found himself in a state of shock when he saw an unexpected guest. The woman in the hat only noted that they did not see themselves for a long time, and asked how they had things here. Kyle still couldn't believe his own eyes, without looking at this stranger in the hat. In the end, he realized that he was faced with a real LN, and this discovery brought him incredible joy. There are many different races in this world, but elves are distinguished from all. Although their number is small, they live extremely long, and their magical power is more than exceeding the potential of other races. The glue gladly meets her guest, noting how long they have not seen, and gently calls it Maluna. The man asks if she really came from the large forest because the road was long. The woman in the hat replies that they are still happy. After that, she looks at the little boy who stands in front of her, and asks who he is and what he does here. Then the husband and his wife approach the protagonist, putting his hands on the boy's shoulders, and with happy smiles, report that they are their son. His name is Kyle, and he is a very good boy. At first, the woman could not believe in what was heard. For a moment she was numb, healing with the answer. And then she decided to clarify whether their son was really talking, or maybe she was misunderstood. He continued to smile like the sun. The head of the Flovavild family with a smile confirmed the woman's rightness in her reflections, and then asked her son not to be so shy before her. In the end, this elf standing in front of him is the author of the book, which he holds in his hands, and the name of this guest is Malin Rozak. Hearing the news, the guy only rolled his mouth with surprise and frozen silently, unable to say a word. The Elfian, noticing his embarrassment, noted that she was not able to remember exactly when she was written by the book, which the main character now holds. Kyle was not embarrassed with words and smiled happily. He noted that it was thanks to Maluna Rizak that he was able to master magic. However, his achievements do not end there. He was going to continue to explain to her how she interrupted him with her rhetorical speeches, but expressed his gratitude, noting that this book became invaluable for him. This meant that she did not write it in vain. These words brought her great pleasure, and after that she asked Kyle if she admired magic. The guy replied without hesitation that yes, or rather, he loves her very, 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 very precisely. Saying these words, his face was illuminated by a bright smile. After that, the parents approached him, and his father proudly announced that everything happened exactly as the protagonist said. He stated that their son was a true genius. The mother added that Kyle can use many different spells. Malena only watched them silently. After that, she sighed and, with decency, said if it really was. But in the flight fields they catch the unusual reaction of the elf. Realizing what was happening, the head of the family asked the woman whether she did not believe them. Therefore, Kyle's foster father asked him to demonstrate the magic of the lady in the hat, and the foster mother urged the boy to impress all those present. Melon only asked the main character to impress them. She could not believe that Flyfields would turn into such stubborn parents. Then she asks the main character to demonstrate her magic. She assures that she will only protect and do nothing more, and Kyle proposes to attack her any spells at his discretion. The guy is a little surprised, but he eventually agrees. They stand against each other, and the parents of Kyle and all the servants in the house retreated not to stand, but loudly, with inspiration, began to support Kyle. As if not hearing their words, he turns to the Elfian, asking what degree of attack to him to choose. The girl, interested in his question, was thinking for a moment. Then she replied that she was absolutely confident in her magic. Having 3 attributes at once, it could protect itself from almost everything and had no reason for fear. She asks the protagonist to hit her with all his strength and apply the most powerful spells, which brings Kaylee to shock. After that, his arms completely wraps the lightning. The girl reached out to start acting and attack the boy. Instead, he calmly replied that he understood everything. He should be struck with all his strength. He put his hands in a special pose. It was stunned by the elf, because she could not predict such. But the protagonist did not notice her facial expression at all. At first he raised his hands and immediately behind him a huge, unknown column. However, it became clear that his strength and power were boundless. Kyle has just stated that he chooses it, referring to a pillar behind him. Melon is covered by shock and horror, because it cannot realize what the guy is doing. However, she feels the air around her trembling, which causes her to strain. At this point, Kyle pronounces a spell that transforms the earth, water, fire, and wind into spears, which are manifestations of its strength. There were 4 balls from this pillar, each of which had its own unique properties. The woman in the hat could not believe her own ears and eyes, so incredible was that she heard and saw. She cannot believe that the protagonist is able to possess 4 attributes. Kyle, without lowering his hand, then reads a spell that states that ice, lightning, light and darkness also turn into spears. That is, the embodiment of his strength. Maluda watches him closely and is not stunned by the joke. She is not able to believe nor to put up with the fact that this guy at the same time possesses all 8 features. Kyle, armed with all his spears, aimed at the elf. Having said the spell, he announced that all 8 spears created by his power would be a reflection of his true essence. After that, all these spears merged into one whole, forming a huge bow with a giant 1 arrow. The protagonist pulled the bowstrings of the bow and aimed at his opponent. The arrow flew directly to Maluna, which she did not expect at all, from which her heart prevailed, because even for her it was too much. The family of the boy and all the servants of the house even more encouraged the main character, so that he would not stop and continue. Malona glanced at the outsiders, who was watching this fight without time, and it did not comfort it at all, as did the attack itself. All she wanted, to finally stop. After that, she raised her hand, putting her in front of her, as if trying to defend herself. But before releasing the arrow, he only noted that she punches absolutely everything in his way, calling her an arrow 8 spears. The arrow, endowed with 8 attributes, flew, aiming directly at Melon. The woman, in her turn, was well aware that it was extremely unfavorable for her, because this attack was extremely powerful even for her abilities. She reached forward, trying to call the spirit of the wind with which she signed the contract. At the same time, she wanted to call someone else, but suddenly stopped. Realizing that she had no time for this, she began to panic and fashionably look for new ideas for her rescue. A tremendously called Silpha, Dwarf, and Undina, ordering them to appear immediately and put it in defense. The next moment they came in front of the arrow and immediately moved to it. Sylph made an attempt to stop it by creating a wall from the wind. Undina turned to the water, causing a wave dance, while the dwarf called for a barrier from rocks. 1. Obtained a giant stone structure immediately after that, which hit the arrow. Only fear can be seen on the elf face, but the guy is covered by anger and indignation when the arrow eventually beats the stone. As a result, there was a grand explosive event that seized all present. The insidious wind swept through the trees after the explosion. He also touched all who watched their duel from the side. After the explosion from the side, only smoke was visible. However, the Elfa and the boy were nowhere, and Kale's parents engulfed. The father noted that nothing was visible and could not understand what had happened. The boy's mother called out loud, named the guest and her son, hoping to hear the answer. Meanwhile, as soon as the explosion came, Maluna picked up her hat, from which a mole flew through the airwave, pulled him on herself, and immediately realized that the situation was extremely risky. Thanks to the call of 3 natural spirits, she only managed to partially distract this blow. However, she remembers that his magical power is simply incredible and incredibly powerful. Suddenly, her thoughts are interrupted by someone's voice, which warns of a magic arrow behind her. Malun covers shock, and it rotates sharply, stunned by fear and surprise, unable to believe in what is heard. As soon as she turned, the arrow hit her forehead. It was a regular small arrow, similar to a pear, with a rubber sucker at the end. The girl watches as the main character comes out of the scattered fog, and cannot understand what had just happened. The guy approaches her with a smile on her face, but suddenly begins to cough lightly, noticing that there is too much dust in the air. It seems to him that the whole land should be returned to the place, and after throwing the spell, he calmly pronounces the words, "Calm down." Suddenly, a powerful wind, almost knocking down the Elfian, rises. As soon as this wind subsides, the fog dissipates, and the earth returns to its original state, as if it were not their duel. Everyone who watches this from the outside first is engulfed, then horror, and they cannot understand how to respond to it. At the same time, Maluna stands in silence, not finding a word, just looking closely at Kyle. It shakes dust from your hands. And at this point, the elf realizes that this child has incredible force. After a while in the estate, the main character sits with a drink that warms his body. Maluna and his parents sit at a separate table nearby and quietly watch Kale. The elfa says that when the protagonist does not do something exceptional, he seems to be an ordinary, very simple guy. After that, she appeals to his parents, who are her friends, to ask them her question again. She thinks about who this mysterious guy named Kyle, and who is he eventually. It drives Demomio and Glue to die down and think before they give their answer. They answer in one voice that Kyle is their beloved son and there is no one else. However, Malun did not feel any sincerity in their words, and only continued to look at them with a terrible facial expression. She stated that everything was clear to her. In order not to return to this topic, she assured them that the issue was resolved and promised to never raise it again. The father of the Flyfield family simply stated that his son was a real genius from nature. The mother noted that Kyle remains a diligent and good boy, Mila. And Maluna, thinking about the village, thought that this couple really gives all their love and care to her son. She decided to share with them one interesting idea. She wondered her long-standing friends if they would not be interested in sending their son to the State Academy of Magic. The main character heard what they were talking about. Full of joy, he jumped and asked if she really refers to the Magical Academy. Elf tells him that in this place people learn to own magic, make new friends, and just find useful acquaintances. She then addresses Kyle directly, asking him about thoughts about it. Does he really seek to compete with other students who came from all over the country to the Academy of Murs? This news struck the protagonist to the depths of his soul. His eyes glowed with admiration, and his face radiated genuine joy. After that, thinking for a moment, he was a little ashamed and confessed that his real dream was to join the Academy of Magic and study there. Then the elf turned to his parents and asked if it was true. His father expressed his opinion that if his son really seeks it, they would give him all sorts of assistance. The mother only noted that the boy would certainly become the center of attention. Kyle rushed to his parents and hugged them. Maluna, meanwhile, thought about how sad the atmosphere is at the airports right now. Further, Elf suggested that once all the details were decided, Kyle needs a mentor who will prepare him for study at the academy. In noble families, children from a young age are raised before. The boy expresses the desire that Malun itself becomes his mentor, but she tried to give it up. However, Kyle notes that he thanks all this knowledge. Although he does not understand much, he already has a teacher. He wants the one who wrote this book is his teacher. Little thinks that everything goes as it should. After all, not everyone is able to curb the full power of this young man. The girl replied that she understood him, but asked to remember. Although he and her child of her girlfriend, she would be extremely harsh. However, the guy just smiles, adding that he is looking forward to their activities. His parents approached him and hugged firmly. Subsequently, such events unfold near the estate. The carriage is approaching the estate. The man sees how the cart comes to their estate. The father asks his son if he did not leave something, which the guy replies, that not. Mom only asks to convey to all teachers when he arrives, but Kyo assures that he knows it. The mother is about to tell him something, but the man stops her, assuring that everything will be fine with him. The guy leaves the estate, assuring her mother so she does not worry. Kyle has already turned 12. He descends the stairs where Maluna is already waiting for him, noting how time he flew quickly. He hurries to the girl, glad that she came to hold him. However, Elf notes that her only student goes to adulthood. She gave him all her knowledge. Now it all depends on his self-confidence and perseverance. However, the protagonist only notes that thanks to Maluni, he gained a deeper understanding of magic. And finally, she sincerely thanks her for his knowledge. The Glue stands at some distance from them, quietly sinking tears. And the man, turning to the sound, cannot understand whether it is a sound barrier. But then Maluna begins the conversation, focusing on the fact that she tells it not as a teacher, but as a person with power. After all, in their world, there are many dark forces that are hidden from ordinary people and become more powerful, gradually going on the surface. She hopes he will not forget. He only assures her what he remembers. Then she pays attention to the bracelet and asks to protect it. The young man promises that he will do, and assures that he will be careful with him. The man cleared his throat and expressed his opinion that the student and the teacher are time to say goodbye, but asks not to forget about them. His wife joins the conversation, noting that it is unfair. Maluna just begs forgiveness. Then he announces that it's time for Kyle to say goodbye to his parents. The guy approaches them without finding words to speak. He thinks that they gladly accepted him, a child left by his parents. He is immersed in deep reflections before finding the appropriate words. After all, they constantly cared for him as if he were their own child. He still has not found a way to thank them for their kindness. They lead him to school with such happiness. The guy points out that it is amazing, because he has many thoughts. However, only words of gratitude are circling in his thoughts, and he cannot hold back tears. His parents also did not restrain his tears, and he expressed their gratitude in so many years of care and upbringing. He is incredibly grateful to them, and together they hug. He remembers everything he was taught, and the love they gave him. He will never forget this, even if he now remains himself with his thoughts. But now he is just moving forward in his carriage to the State Academy. The Academy of Magic of the Kingdom, located in the heart of the capital, and is subordinated directly to the royal court, is the best place to study magic. After completing his studies at Maluni, the main character went there to gain new knowledge. The history of this institution, like a silver thread, permeates the whole history of the state. Many gifted people who studied at the academy have become warriors and knights. Studying magic reveals to you the opportunity to show your abilities and even make useful acquaintances. But the most important thing is that you can meet real friends. And here was a new student in front of her door. He was called Kyle Flyfield. Its crystalline ball looked black. He was the only one who could grasp all the magical attributes. In the spacious hall of the academy, a girl in a hat with a friendly smile meets every newcomer. The teacher reports that it is time to start testing. The results of this exam will determine to which classes they will be enrolled. There will be 3 tests: a total magical energy, its ability to control and power. According to the results of this test, they will be divided into classes from A to F at the State Academy of Magic. The main thing is power. If they get to one of the upper classes, then life in the academy will be the best period in their lives. If it is in lower places, the girl asks to make every effort during the tests. Now she will call them all in turn. The boys began to worry and actively discuss everything. Kyle is looking forward to what trials are waiting for him, and he is not eager to find out. Going to the table behind which the professors gathered, he corrects his clothes and apologizes to them. He adds that she is passionate about gaining new knowledge. After that, the professors are asked to put their palm on the subject next to him. He fulfills their request and asks himself whether he did the right thing. The woman explains to him that it is a device for measuring the stock of magical energy, and the higher the figure, the better for him. Suddenly, the explosions begin to sound, and the object begins to split. The woman could not understand the situation and think deeply about whether the eyes were really shining. The man broke out of his chair and asked what he had done. Kyle only replies that nothing happens at all, and here his arrow begins to rotate madly. The numbers on it change quickly. Teachers carefully watch his actions. They just can't believe that he has so many points. More specifically, the counter was at 0, so he is informed that the result is 0 points. Such an assessment of a mana has received Kyle. The teachers told the students that the measuring device has failed, so they would have to postpone the test. But the guy is not in any way involved. Kyle followed him to the second test room. Some objects quickly circle around the perimeter. The old man meets him and reports that it is time to check his ability to control magic. The results of this test depend on the number of hits into the target by means of magic. After he provides all his explanations, he asks the guy whether he is ready. He replies in the affirmative. Suddenly he is mentioned by Maluni's words she spoke in class. She advised him that, despite all his talents, it was better to keep it secret, at least as he succeeds. And until something really unusual happens, she asked him to be satisfied only with the wind. He looked and counted only 200 small targets. He creates the wind in his hands and is sure that it will be enough. There are 4 victories next to him. It causes a real shock at the professor. He will not understand where so many magic balls came from. The main desire of the guy is to reach A rank and earn 200 points. He directs his balls forward, seeking to be involved in all purposes. He arranges an explosion of great power with the help of his balls. According to the professor, he tried to escape from him. This brings horror to the professor, and immediately after that the device begins to signal. This guy thinks that he managed to do everything right. He says everything was prepared. The old man asks if everything is destroyed. After that, Kyle gladly runs up and asks how much he got. The device found only 1 point. The old man explains that the counter fixes the signal when the blow gets into the target. He suggests that it is most likely due to the simultaneous destruction of all goals. Then the guy thinks that his assessment should be higher. However, the professor apologizes to him, explaining that the most important number is the number on the meter, which is why his estimate is F. The boy was already in the 3rd test room where the professor is waiting for him. He reports that his magic will be checked here. Then he asks me to use the most powerful spell to attack this golem. The attack power will be shown on the display placed on the golem's chest. The young man claims that he is aware of everything, but the man asks why Kyle is so upset. He clapped him well on his back and urged not to fall in spirit. Then the guy asks him if you only need to attack a gallop. However, the man notes that, despite his young age, Kyle did not even shake after his class. He thinks of what his body is. He cast a suspicious look at him and thought about something. Then the guy asks if he can really overcome this industry by giving all his strength. The man was stunned and could not grasp the meaning of his question. However, the young man explains that he is only afraid to break him. In response, with sophisticated peace, the professor reassures him, noting that this goal is just to try to break. After all, he is able to withstand his blow. Since Kyle is still small, he assured that nothing would happen to him. Then the guy says he will definitely get acquainted with it. After that, he stated that it was time to start, and a powerful wave of wind covered the room at the same moment. It surprised the man. He immediately noticed that it was an extremely powerful compression of magical energy. Kyle thinks that he needs to take at least 1 exam successfully so as not to drive a little one in an uncomfortable position. He imposes a spell of Wind Fang. He opened his mouth, stunned by unexpectedness. The professor cannot understand what kind of magic it belongs to. The main character directs his hand forward, preparing for the attack. He orders fangs to plunge into the flesh. In addition, he ordered them to disassemble everything into pieces. In the end, his blow is about the industry, and this causes a powerful explosion. The explosion was so powerful that its sound was opened even outside the room. Someone responded to it and turned. Passers-by, surprised to hear, could not understand whether the earth was really shining, whether it was only a game of their imagination. The girl standing by the window realized that everything happened in the 3rd test hall. Meanwhile, in the room, the professor sits on the floor, fully stunned by events. The goal was completely destroyed, and only the debris remained from it. He also broke the magic meter. Because of this, its result remains unknown. However, the man was surprised that Kyle was really able to break him, and then asked not to worry about it, and suggested that the boy go to the main hall. Kyle only lowered his head and remained silent. The professor's vigilant gaze pierced the guy, from which he shuddered and finally got off. He noted that he understood everything and expressed his gratitude. Doing it, he worshipped and said goodbye to him. Kyle came out, immersed in his reflections, and the professor looked again to look at him again. The man asks him to inform him that the magic counter has failed, and then he puts the phone. Suddenly, the girl approaches him and says she heard the explosion. This girl is called Frey. She also admits that it caused her great curiosity, because the explosion was heard even workers with a smile, she would forgive him for the story of this guy. He turned and looked at her. He tells her that at first glance seems to be an ordinary guy, though it has a fragile look. But it's not really true. However, it cannot give an accurate answer, because the counter is broken. However, he has never encountered an industry that could be destroyed by magic loans. He has no idea how many teachers were already thinking about it, because, in fact, everything is not as easy as it seems. However, it would be easiest to call this guy a monster. Frey just smiles, hoping that Kyle will be in her class. Meanwhile, the examination of the exam is announced in the main hall of the academy. The guy looks at his results and is not at all surprised because he has a class F. He said that there is nothing wrong here, because knowledge can be gained in any class. So he boldly moved forward. He later left the main building and went in search of his hostel. Although he could not immediately navigate where his new shelter was located, but according to the map, he had to be somewhere nearby. He carefully examined every detail. Soon he found himself next to the old and abandoned house. It seemed that no one lived here for a long time. Carefully opening the front door, he looked inside. In his thoughts, a vague uncertainty lit up. Was it really the right way? He looked around carefully, noticing old and shabby furniture. All walls and tables were cracked and contaminated. Turning into the further review, he just mentioned how he recently saw other classes. Everything was completely different. Cleanliness prevailed everywhere. The desks were whole and tidy. The protagonist, bypassing the ranks of the tables, stopped suddenly and, passionate about a sudden sound, instantly turned around. There I noticed a young girl who seemed both extremely decisive and depressed at the same time. Her face clearly reflected confusion and annoyance from everything that had fallen on this difficult moment. The guy began to watch her carefully, while she, without noticing him, just walked by. When she reached her table and sank on a chair, a deep sigh broke out of her mouth. Kyle could no longer tolerate. He decided to find out the girl if she was in order. The girl, who flowed tears from her eyes, just asked not to pay attention to her. The whole problem is that she is the daughter of the aristocrat. For her great regret, she does not have a magical talent. It was because of this that it was attributed to the worst class. The main character did not fully realize the meaning of herd. There is no talent. He decided to clarify her. However, the girl, continuing to sob, replied that he understood everything right. Finally, Kale came to what she meant. As soon as he was going to ask her something more, his attention was distracted by the sound that came from the door. A group of men with their shoulders and sad faces came into the office. They leaned over their tables. Some of them did not restrain and wept. The teenager strengthened his eyes, covering his face with an immense shame. Someone began to truly indulge, and at the same moment the other person grabbed himself by his head, not knowing what to do next and how to do in such a difficult situation. The protagonist watched everyone, noticing that the students looked completely depressed, but could not understand why this was happening. The girl who sat near him at the table and continued to cry said that only aristocrats had a chance of success. Kyle decided to find out if that's the case. The young lady agreed, noting that the main reason is that children from rich families master magic from early childhood. Thanks to this, they improve their performance at the academy, but they still find themselves here. If they continue in the same spirit, they will not even be able to look into their relatives soon. And now the protagonist finally realized what was happening and why these guys were so frustrated. The girl continues the story, noting that the vast majority of students of the academy are descendants of noble or even royal families. Therefore, getting a child into a lower class can affect the reputation of the whole kind. However, the protagonist cannot understand, because recently the girl confessed to him that she is completely devoid of any talents. Although he feels that her magical power far exceeds the capabilities of all others in this class. He tries to say something, continuing to leave behind the girl's traces. He addresses her, noting that although they are in Class F, he believes that good teachers can still get good teachers, so they will have to try very much. He has wondered if her talent really remains quite hidden. Hearing these words, the girl stops crying and slowly turns her head to him. Kyle, glowing with a smile, happily points out that she finally paid attention to him. He calls his name, Kyle Phillisfield, and expresses his hope that they can become friends. This stunned the girl, forcing her to plunge into the sea of embarrassment and nerve tremor. She rapidly jumped out of the chair, and her voice flew in the hall, announcing all those present that her name is Kitty Frederick. For a long time, she began to make a stiffness. However, she cannot understand something. What? For what reason did this man appear before her? She searched the capital along and across, but did not find any hint of his presence. And despite the fact that the image of his delicate silver hair was in front of her eyes, as if alive, also unsurpassed is his golden eyes, which emit gentle light, giving the impression that they can penetrate through any secrets. Ur realized that she was not mistaken. This person she saw 7 years ago saved her with the soldiers from goblin and other monsters. Now she is sure that she is greeted by her own life. When all the memories come back to her, she sharply returns to the main character and asks if he remembers her. Once upon a time, young children, they accidentally met in the forest when other children watched them. Suddenly, a woman with strapped hair comes into the class and interrupts Kitty's projection. She appeals to all those present, ordered them to silence. Everyone around instantly fades. To be more precise, the expression of horror is shaking their faces, and they are unable to believe that their teacher stands in front of them. Kitty is also shocked, and the main character only surprised such an unexpected turn of events. He almost showed no emotions. After short thought, he looked at her with a smile and assured, "Everything is wonderful." The woman threatened with her foot and stated that everyone in the room was just spiritually weak. That is why they were in Class F. The woman clarified if everything was clear to them. though she hoped that so. She then reported that she would be their class leader, and her name is Frey. Its elements are fire and wind. The protagonist looks at her with full admiration and glitter of hope in her eyes. Frey noticed his gaze. She is wondering who is not afraid of her cry, and she began to flip through the pages of her magazine. She realized who it was. He was the guy who overcame Golem. Kyle thinks that it is amazing as she intensified her voice with magic, although he did not expect anything less than teachers. After that, Frey decides to ask her class why everyone is so sad, although all her practical classes with classes F are the same atmosphere. If you don't like something, let them speak. She asks guys if they think this old house is unattractive, or they are concerned that the lower class definition will appear on their families. However, she reminds them that you do not do anything, and it remains only to put up with the situation. All because this academy is studying elite magicians. In her opinion, everyone in the class is simply a departure of the magical community. This causes Kitty to sob even harder, and the main character notices changes in her behavior. While they are still tears, Frey continues his speech without hesitation. She assures that we should try to take every effort, but at the same time asks that they do not forget about something important. It is said that no matter how efforts the lower classes of society try, it will always remain in its place, and you will not do anything with it. After these words, he asked if everyone understood it. Kyle thought deeper. After that, he gets out of his seat and raises his hand, while Miss Frey's insidious miss prompts him to give her a word. Kitty slowly turns his head to look at him, and tears are constantly flowing from her eyes. The teacher recognized him, so on her face a smile blossomed. She realized that he wanted to ask, and urged him not to be ashamed and express his question. He only noted that she completely shares her opinion, and that gifted students deserve a greater remuneration than others. The girl sitting next to him is frozen. All other students also turn to him, flooding with complete surprise. It is a little annoyed with Frey, but she agrees with him. However, Kyle did not stop there and asked another question. Other children could not understand what was wrong with him and believed that he was just trying to lay. He asks if they can prove that they are better, and then the academy will change their attitude towards them. This question causes everyone to be suddenly. Frey asks irritates whether he really listened to any of her words. Despite their efforts, higher classes will always ahead of others, because they will not only improve their skills, but also strengthen even more, which makes them almost impossible. Kyle specifies whether it is true, to which Frey frankly matches the affirmative. After all, hundreds of students have already crossed their dreams, seeking them hopeless. The grueling workouts did not produce any results, because they could not be compared with the execution of students who were superior. In short, talent is a crucial component. All her former students have ever apologized for her for being doomed to be a failure. So she asked them to stop dreaming. Kyle suggests that it may be so, but she has expressed something before. Namely, it has never happened before. And to clarify whether this guy understood it correctly, it scares all students, including Frey. Then Kyle states that their class will become the first to destroy this axiom talent as representatives of Class F. This guy is serious. This brings Frey into shock. In the end, she remembers how she told her last class, which she would definitely teach them everything, and asked not to give up. But it just causes a smile to be a teacher. She laughed loudly, noting that Kyle was extremely bold before her, calling him shameless. And yet, if such a miracle happens, it will be quite interesting, because it will be ready to dispute with the administration, even if you have to risk your own life. This frightened cat. The protagonist was overwhelmed by the joy of learning about this news. After that, Frey only noted that she relied on their help. The inspired hero goes and slowly inspects a wonderful hostel that has an unfriendly aura for him. His thoughts are only occupied by the fact that it is in this place he will spend the next 3 years of his life. He notes that the building is quite high quality. Dissolving the large and massive wooden doors, the boy's eyes shone even brighter than what he saw. After all, the whole room was covered with gold, and the furniture is so neat and shiny that they were literally shimmering in the eyes. His interest is attracted by a group of people who gathered closely and focused on something. A boy sits on the floor. He cries. Everyone fled to him, especially the one who looked with the evil smile. Although Kyle did not interfere, he listened carefully and focused on what was discussed, and watched their actions closely. The guy sitting on the floor stood up. He asked the one who stood in front of him why he hit him, because he just sat quietly until he spoke it all, and wept. The boy's name is Delia. He is studying in Class 1F, and his element, Earth. He decided to explain to him that the whole thing was that the guy with scratches on his face was studying in Class 1F, and his presence and principle spoils the air. This guy is named Turk. He studies in Class 1A, and his element is a fire. The land, wiping tears streaming across his face, only said that even for class, it was too much, and he clearly overdo it with his moralization. The Turk continued to laugh at a malicious laugh, noting that if the guy still has the strength to be indignant, it testifies only one thing: he still lacked. Saying these words, he clenched his fists, hinting that he was ready to strike. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, the main character appears right in front of Delia. He with great interest and pleasure asks whether a guy with scratches on his face is a classmate. The guy returned to Delia, continuing the conversation, and informed that he was called Kyle, and noted that he was pleased to meet her. Another guy with scratches on his face also named his name and greeted a new acquaintance. After that, Delia, still pouring tears, realized that she had already seen Kyle when he asked questions to their class teacher, but the Turk remained deaf to their touching speeches. As soon as he learned that the protagonist also came from the lower class, instantly lifted his fist in his direction and asked with sarcasm whether he was also from Class F, announcing that he would be enough for all present. Kale was barely aware of how hostile to him the Turk was. He immediately became serious. Due to the power of magic, it cleverly avoided the impact. As a result, the guy was on the floor. Meanwhile, Turk did not stop at the floor, but the protagonist only noted that such a pace can be injured. The guy who stretched on the floor turned to Kyle. As he got to his feet, his comrades who stood in the crowd turned to the Turk, asking what he was doing. They advised him not to allow students from the lower classes to humiliate it. Turk said without hesitation that he was well aware of the whole situation. Hearing their conversation, the protagonist asked the boy if his name was Turk. But Kale's style of communication seemed to paralyze the young man himself with fear. The protagonist asked the young man why he hit Delia. It stunned the Turk, and he was completely confused, not knowing what to answer. Kyle continued to insist in a gloomy tone that he would finally be answered. The Turk could not say anything clear, and around the crowd he was loudly buried by Kale. They could not understand why he just froze in place. Suddenly someone touched his shoulder, which was incredibly surprised by the Turk. "Do not be ready for it," the man who put his hand on his shoulder, only assured that everything was fine. When the Turk turned, he saw Mr. Sykes with surprise. This boy also studies in Class 1A, his element is a fire, and his name is Sykes Oldinlate. Dahlia could not believe that he was really the son of an ancient dynasty, and surprise did not disappear from her face. The protagonist, noticing the impressed expression of a new acquaintance, decided to ask if this name was familiar to her. Delia replied that the family has a great reputation, and is famous for raising only the most prominent swordsmen. They said that this year the genius of their kind would join the academy. It was then that Kyle realized that it was an old yellowed photo album. He is the genius from the majestic family. Sykes in turn noted that Group F could use a vacation room without hesitation. The Turk, meanwhile, fell into the mess and exclaimed in response. However, suddenly Sykes became serious and spoke sincerely to all present. He reported that someone in this room resorts to magic. Now he is wondering if he will be able to reveal who does it. All present were amazed because no one even suspected what it is possible. They did not understand how it could be magic, whether someone could notice it at all. The psyche continued, directing his finger to the main character, and stated that he pushed him with the help of the wind and threatened with words in which magical power was hidden. He then clarified whether he understood the situation correctly. After he heard the crowd began to call him not the most pleasant person from Class F. Kyle just smiled widely and asked if it was really catching the eye. The protagonist believed that he successfully hit it. Tuck was angry, approached Kale and expressed his indignation that he used magic with a thumb. It was a sneaky act towards him. However, Sykes urged him to stop it. He said he should think about it because he himself cannot see the whole picture. It is shocking, Turk. Sykes returns to the main character and notes that it is still difficult to imagine how a person from Class F managed to circle the elite's finger from Class A. He thinks of who Kayla really is and what personality he hides this character. Suddenly, a loud appeal sounded, calling the boys to calm down immediately and stop all the actions. This voice belonged to the head of the hostel. Its element is water, and its name is Glecia. At the same time, when she ran to them, she hurriedly asked what was happening here. After all, when he came to them, the protagonist reassured her, assuring that nothing was happening here. After all, they only offended his friend, and he was just upset, that's all. Nothing special. All he wants is to apologize to Turk. However, Turk himself categorically disagrees. insisting that deciding whether to apologize remains him. The Glania calls on everyone to calm down and promises to listen to them a little later. However, she now asks everyone to return to her rooms and not worry about anything. Suddenly, Frey appears from nowhere and gently hugs her shoulders. She notes that the case is not done. Then it is asked where these newcomers come from so much energy to spend it. After that, she asks how at such an age you can reassure emotions after the conflict. Kida notices Kyle and Frey. Suddenly, a male voice is heard from behind, denying all the questions of Frey. This voice belongs to the Rego, class teacher 1A. It has the elements of fire and wind. Reago warns that if you ignore the situation, the conflict may in the future even more. The Glazer in despair tries to stop it. However, Frey confirms the right of the man, noting that there is only the only way. She suggested that they solve everything with a match. Kyle only points out that it sounds interesting. Sykes can't believe his eyes. However, Turk Laugh states the protagonist that his victory is impossible, but he refuses to believe him. The Turk continues, noting that it is better for him to hurry. After all, if he loses, he will have to leave the academy. He still believes that such as Kyle, they do not deserve training in it. Kitty says it's too much. Kyle agrees to this fight. He thinks of what will happen in the event of his victory. He points his finger to the sake bottles. His requirement was to transfer the Psyche to Class F. The teachers were also in full shock, and the guys who watched the whole picture were also surprised. In the midst of Luda, Tuck asked if Kyle was not wishing to apologize. However, the main character does not understand what it is about. In the end, logic suggests that he has to apologize to the deed. The apology will have to ask in all circumstances, even if Sykes wins, that the Turk is only annoying. However, he is worried that Sykes will approach Kyle and ask if it is a couple. In order to avoid misunderstandings, he explains the situation. Either Kyle is calculated, or Sykes is transferred to Class F. The protagonist nods approvingly, adding to all the smile. After that, the psycho becomes extremely threatening and strictly warns the boy so that he does not even think of obeying his orders. After that, he asked whether he understood the interlocutor correctly, and thinks about whether the protagonist really believes in his own strength. It will not be easy to overcome if you believe Sykes. Everyone was covered by the fear of the threatening aura that enveloped Sykes. Kyle only laughed quietly and assured that he believed in his capabilities. It stunned that guy. None of the audience could expect it. After that, the psychologist assured that everything is fine. Even after agreeing to this couple, others began to be noticeably nervous. Thank Burson for saying, everything has already been decided, so everyone wants to look at the hall. In the end, a duel will take place between classes A and F, while the students of Class F standing through the Kyle. Meanwhile, Class A students are happy and eagerly waiting for this duel. Frey with burning eyes waits when the battle finally begins, and the Glania is nervous at this time. The torn into pieces did not express any emotions. All together went to the gym, and at the head of the whole action are the main characters of the program, Kyle and Sykes. When they arrive at the training arena, the protagonist begins to consider it with delight. Bypassing the columns, he cannot believe that the battle will really happen here. It seems to him that this arena is too small for such events. However, as soon as he took a few steps forward, a huge stadium unfolded in front of him. Raho approaches the young man and is wondering if he is surprised. After all, this arena is the creation of the district Mespazio, one of the founders of the academy and the last owner of spatial magic. Reagan assures the man that all safety measures are already foreseen, and as soon as the battle begins, the barriers will protect the audience from any threat. And even if you destroy obstacles, they will instantly recover, so this arena is perfect. After describe this place, Kyle was endlessly passionate. He then specifies whether magic can really be used without restrictions. Small Regions replies that, of course, you can, and proposes to demonstrate all your skills. At this point, Frey attracts him. He asks her what happened. The woman thinks that Kyle is likely to apply the same magic as during the test. It worries how it affects the arena if it puts all its efforts. She thinks it will be interesting. With a smile on his face, asks the boy to be careful not to hurt during the battle. Kyle assures that everything is fine. The Glace waves his hand, inviting the protagonist and Psyche to step into the arena. Now they stand opposite each other. The girl then addresses the participants asking if they prepare their sticks. Sykes lightly pulled the sword out of his inner jacket pocket. The attendees could not agree whether it was really a magic wand, or the man used the sword as a catalyst. Reggett only exclaims from surprise, but in thought he thinks that it is a magic sword in which the spirit of fire lives, and of course, he knows about those who use weapons as catalysts. He has a sword filled with a spirit of fire that the family entrusted him, thus demonstrating his great hopes. Then he turned his gaze on Kyle's magic wand. It looked very comical and lightly compared to Sykes. It was a great cheerful of the Turks. He could not cope with the assumptions that the child was holding in his hands. Others only noted that nothing else was expected from the lower class. Viewers are unanimously admitted. It is even difficult to call it a battle. Sykes cannot understand what is happening. As you know, the quality of the magic wand is extremely important for magical tools. A beautiful wand can significantly increase the power of spells, and Kayla has only a simple wooden wand. It seemed to him that the boy would have something, but he put too much hope on him. Glacia said she would explain the rules of the duel. This is the arena exclusively for training. When they leave its boundaries, all the injuries received here will be healed. If they get a life-threatening damage, the match will be completed instantly. Thus, they can be taught at full force. The Dialia cannot understand why it says it so easily. Galatia recalls that the special condition of the duel is that if Sykes is defeated, it will be transferred to Class F. In case of defeat, Kyle will be forced to leave the academy forever. The victory is determined at the moment when one of the participants recognizes its defeat or will not be able to continue the match. She also notes that the judge has the right to intervene and stop the fight. Explaining all the rules, she asks whether they remained questions. Brunette was concentrated. The corners of his lips had a dissatisfied expression. Narrow eyes, narrowing, as if the insightful views of the cat closely followed the enemy. Long, dark hair fell on his eyes. Around the guys, the air seemed to be compacted. In the blue eyes, the blonde reflected the same innocence as in the look of the deer. His eyelashes, white, like his hair, gave him a special charm. Short-trimmed hair was barely touched with thick eyelashes, giving the impression of lightness and air. A girl was a little tense from them. Her long hair gently fell with a light bang on the forehead. The girl's eyes were hiding behind round glasses. From the ears hanged earrings drops. She gave permission to those who stood nearby. Since consent is given, the magical match between Sykes and Kale, approved by the Academy, will take place immediately. Academy students who watched the events reacted differently. Some of them focused and closely monitored everything. The children in the back rows were crying. Some felt confused, while others watched everything with a satisfied smile. Suddenly, a woman's hand flew in the air, ready to signal to the beginning of the duel to the participants. They were given time to prepare. As soon as the signal of the beginning of the battle, several children who watched the events raised their hands to the air to support. Bruneta resisted his weapon, but was in no hurry to threaten his opponent, while Blondin pulled out his magic wand while preparing for a fight. The older boys, raising their hands up, shouted to Mr. Sykes. Encouraging him to go forward, they called his opponent unnecessary, wishing him to receive on merit. The boy, who began to tears before the fight began, grabbed his own hair. It was completely covered by panic. He was convinced that everything that was happening was because of him. From large, childish round eyes, tears were pouring, like a river. Next to the crying baby was a girl who folded his palm in prayer. Her hair developed in the wind. The eyes were wide open, watching everything with enthusiasm. At that moment, her thoughts were only about Kyle. He finally raised the sword in the form, choosing a fighting rack. His weapon immediately immersed himself in a flame, which, surprisingly, did not cause him any harm and did not spill over his clothes. The young man was boiling from rage and was tuned to win. He had no doubt that the duel would end as soon as possible. His face was decorated with a sinister smile. Blondin, seeing the flame, lowered his wand. In his eyes, childhood curiosity was lit, as if he did not know the seriousness of the situation. He was only interested in the enemy's impressive sword. He asked if he possessed magic. Brunette, noticing the irresponsibility of his opponent, asked if he was going to stand without action, as if not in a duel. Although the opponent did not even try to defend himself, the brunette has already raised the sword ready to attack. From afar, he lifted the sword, performing a horizontal stroke. His purpose was not to overcome the enemy with the blade, but to release numerous magical fiery spheres that rapidly flew in the direction of the enemy. The audience detained the admiration and did not hold back the shouting when she saw a huge number of fiery balls. All magical fiery spheres, without exception, were kissed exactly for the target. It was obvious to all present. However, the blond man remained adamant without moving from the place and making no movement. Only when the bullets were quite close did he lift the magic wand, bringing it closer to the face. He directed him towards the enemy, and as soon as it happened, All the spheres that flew to the guy suddenly changed their course and hit the ground, moving away from him. Brunetta was stunningly watching this, widely opened his cat's eyes with surprise. Those who watched could not believe their eyes. They discussed how all the attacks flew by without affecting anyone. But it is simply impossible. Did Mr. Sykes make such a mistake? Burnett merged and poured out curses. A man in glasses with a long braid, who watched this scene, thought. He understood that Sykes did not miss. This is all over Kyle. He managed to change the trajectory of all fiery spheres using the wind, but he did it so quickly that others could not even notice it. The piercing guy wondered. Why did Keel, having such abilities and magic, stayed in Group F? And all this he succeeded without much effort. A calm smile continued to play on his face. Sykes suddenly realized that he missed, but he attributed this loss to the wind magic used by Blondin against the Turk. His face looked at the same time annoyed and jumped. Kyle, at a timely manner, noted that it was really interesting. But is it really all that Sykes is capable of? This last phrase brought Brunette out of herself, and he exclaimed to his opponent, asking again. Kyle, smiling, added that he was more interested in the sword's power that he was tried to attack, but the power of his opponent. For psychologists, these words were performed as a powerful blow. His face was immediately overwhelmed with astonishment and shock. However, when he came out, he clenched his teeth, trying to smile. However, he decided not to listen to the advice of his advisor and did not throw the sword sideways. On the contrary, he was preparing to strike an even more powerful blow. It was like a fiery swirl in the sky, Haitian. He was convinced that it would be extremely difficult to avoid such an attack. Kyle's words were so angry that they lived on the forehead strain like strings. However, the hero, while remaining unmoved, raised his rod vertically towards the rush. It seemed that Sykes, overflowing with anger and despair, shouted insanely that his spell was the strongest. One day, a bright light suddenly flashed before him, forcing him to die in place. Turning his head to her side, he only rolled his eyes, realizing what was happening. Due to his magical abilities, Kyle has expanded this fiery tornado, hiding himself and his opponent from other people's eyes. Only two of them remained at the epicenter of a firestorm. People on the opposite side did not understand what was happening. Everything around was filled with a storm that absorbed the flame. The girl in the glasses that agreed to these fights, holding her head, tried to escape from there as soon as possible. Among the storm, Sykes, he was enthusiastically asked what Kale has now conceived after such an incredible trick. A friendly idea in its simplicity was to avoid unnecessary eyes. This was especially true of the girl who from the beginning of the fight observed them with an interesting smile. Sykes demonstrated Kyle higher magic, so now he has to respond, right? He said, stretching his right hand sideways. Lowering his palm down, he began to spell. The best confrontation of fiery magic is the magic of water. It is obvious to everyone. Of all the possible options, it is the most effective. Sykes, listening carefully to his reasoning, looked at the interlocutor in question. As if trying to touch him, Sykes said that he only owned the magic of the air, so why discuss this issue? Kyle remained in place, creating spells with a free hand. He finally lifted his gaze, directing him directly to the opponent, smiling a little, and relaxed, which he considered it boring, because he found a more interesting option. Somehow unexpectedly, like a small explosion, the flames escaped from his palm. The fascinated brunette with a surprisingly observed sight. The blonde man decided to use fire magic, just as Sykes did. He asked if this gesture would be a problem for him. However, the response of the enemy would no doubt change anything. He stood with a stretched hand, all covered with fire, and continued to smile. But his view no longer emitted either kindness or peace. The hair of a dark-haired man was fluttering from the power of another's magic. Not able to believe what is happening, Sykes asked. Does he really use fiery magic? Is this guy able to control two elements at the same time? But is it real? Kyle decided to make sure that it was not a 6x chapel and asked him a question about it. Brunetta was nervously prepared for protection, but when he heard the question, he shuddered. The blonde wanted to demonstrate everything he was capable of. Now no one will notice them, and no one will stop. Kyle's eyes were becoming more insane. Although they stood out of the storm, simply watching this swinging waterfall, doing nothing. A girl with long hair and glasses looked at it with fear. They could not see what was happening inside. It's dangerous. She turned to others with a question. Should they stop the fight? A man in glasses and with a piercing behind her watched the events silently. The other noted that there are no problems now. After all, Kyle created this dome specifically. However, the Frey's answer did not satisfy everyone. She realized that the guy tried to hide something from their eyes. The man in the glasses could not understand what Kale sought to protect them all. Crossing his hands on his chest, he patiently waited for the explanation. But she has no idea, because she anticipates that he will use something extremely powerful. So young Sykes was clearly unlucky to be trapped. Sykes realized that his opponent is clearly distinguished by abnormal force. He could not hide his true power. If the attack is applied, it can work. Hank. He tried to focus on Kylie, but his balance was obviously broken. He lifted his sword with both hands, enveloping himself with flames. He shouted a spell on full breasts to the Great Spirit that lived in weapons, asking him to absorb his magical power. For the sake of his family, he must win. The flames, gathering in his palm, began to twist along the blade of the sword, turning into a small fire dragon that resembled his body. This fiery beast even got fangs. The flames grew uncovered, gaining strength and size, flying up, lifting a whole cloud of dust around. Kyle had to raise her hand to protect his face from this storm. He stood in the middle of a huge cloud of dust, opening his eyes wide, and with unspeakable surprise did not look away from his opponent. Brunetta, leaning on his back leg, tried to survive, using all his strength. He chose from all spells exactly what was calling for a fire rescuer. The flames on his sword were solidly drawn in the form of a rounded blade. His cloak danced under the gusts of wind. He threatened Kyle, which may not even remain dust. It is clear that he was incredibly angry with this situation. In general, this reaction is quite predictable. If so, Kyle should not be indifferent. He reached forward again, preparing a spell in his palms. He is about to demonstrate a psychic something incredible. Lifting his palm up, he immediately wrapped himself with a huge pillar of fire, which with a roar flew into the sky with a terrific force. The example has frozen in place, watching Kayla's fire changes its color. The blonde himself smiled at that moment. His eyes were not visible because of his hair, which was gracefully fluttered in the wind. They used a blue flame spell. His fire turned into a monster, endowed with many sharp clips and burning eyes. Many sparks took the look of a thick wool that was barely shaking from the light breeze. The brunette froze, like a statue, looking closely at what flared up in front of him. It was the flame of Kyle, a fire that burns even hotter than red. Blue flames. It stood as if a huge shadow behind Blondin's figure, lifting her head to the sky. Sykes tried to focus. It is not time to surprise every little thing now. His face twisted out of indignation, and he even began to gnash his teeth. As a family heir, he is not eligible for defeat. He shouted hard, and the indifferent Kyle watched it without any emotions. He approached a fair-haired man, raising his sword, intending to impress him with flames. His eyes were burning with a white fire of anger. The ashy man did not wait for a blow. He raised his hand from which the flame broke out, causing a blue fiery wolf. He ordered his monster to absorb the flames of the opponent. At the same moment, numerous fangs appeared before the eyes, directed directly to it, hoping to absorb its strength. He just watched expandedly and could not look away, watching how it was approaching. The sword of a dark-haired man flew up, twisting around his axis. The whole fire shell that covered the weapon was scattered wherever. People have noticed that the air dome began to weaken and holes appeared in it. The girl, who was near the upset baby, pressed her palms to the heart, anticipating what would open their eyes. Frey and girl in glasses simultaneously revealed the mouths of surprise. The Sykes' sword was stuck in a tile that cracked from a powerful stroke of the sword when it falls. When the dome finally dispelled, the viewer saw Sykes' sword stuck in a tile. Sykes himself, standing on one knee, sat next to him, but turned the other way. Kyle stood motionless on two legs, hiding his face under a thick bang. One of Mr. Sykes' friends suddenly summoned him to the duel. Sykes was in good face, stared at the enemy and showed a wicked smile. His most powerful spell did not work. This is a defeat. The spell he uttered was absorbed by the impressive magic energy of Kyle. It was the blonde that remained full of strength. He smiled, lifting a magic wand. Then he appealed to the brunette with a call to rise, asking that he could still show her. Sykes plunged into a state of numbness. It seemed as if he were poured with ice water, which brought him to his senses. How can he still be able to continue the fight after such a powerful spell? And he behaves as if he did not participate in it. This was angered by a brunette, But despite his anger, he honestly stated that he would not show anything more. Hearing these words, Kyle stopped and looked at him in surprise. He lowered his head to the ground, hiding his eyes and clinging to his knee. Staying on his knees, the brunette realized that he had been defeated. His sword was in cracks and is no longer suitable for battle. They remained in their places without saying a word. Spectators from Sykes and Kyle were surprised to watch what was happening. A girl with long hair and in glasses that allowed the students to have this match decided to declare the results as soon as possible, while everyone was struck and silent. Having stretched her hand forward, she proclaimed the winner of this competition, Kyle Flavoire. Toddlers, with tears of joy on their faces, have groaned with happiness, watching the victory of their friend in this battle. A man in glasses and with a scythe muffled something without finishing the phrases to the end. It was only understood that it was about something related to psychics. Freya turned away, feeling that there was no point in breaking the sword. The sword was already lying on the ground, showing 2 elegant scratches crossing the cross in the middle of his blade. Brunette watched this from sadness. He took his weapon and, with a characteristic click, gently turned it into the vagina. Realizing that the forces had not yet returned to him, he silently asked for forgiveness, though he did not understand what exactly. Feeling some movement in front of him, he lifted his head. Before him was an extended hand, which he offered to help Blondin. Kyle stretched his hand warmly, smiling at Dykes in Class F. He was fond of this fight, calling him wonderful, and suggested that the brunettes be strengthened together. His face shone, and his cheeks were burning. Opening his eyes widely from such a friendly attitude, Brunonette first looked at him silently. He thought about his desire to become stronger. In the end, getting up from the ground alone and neglected with his hand out, he said he never expected to hear that. He reached out to his hand, noting that learning with such a strong guy as he could be extremely useful. Finally, a light smile appeared on his mouth instead of a habitual smile. He hopes that he can learn a lot from Kyle. Finally, they shook their hands, closing their eyes and smiling slightly. Kyle replied that it was a mutual feeling. The surrounding joyfully welcomed such a final with a duel. Those who supported Sykes were full of surprise and anger. One of this trinity, struck by how easily was defeated, quickly moved away, thinking that now he would have to shake his hand to the person they all hate. This guy really has a remarkable talent, and many have understood it. The children, rubbing tears, immediately ran to him burning with their eyes. Teachers continued to discuss the situation with each other. The elf thought about what would happen to Class F when the Psychors would go to them. However, Frey did not have a clear answer to this question, because she did not know what was waiting for them. She barely smiled noticeably, with a note of the approach, noting that the next lesson will certainly arouse her of great interest. The elf, a little embarrassed, asked Frey what she was doing. She just laughed, saying that it was a trifle and she just looks forward to something. Their voices were moving further, and a school with a striking architecture came on the horizon. A huge rock stood from the battlefield. At its land was a figure in a long mantle and black boots, watching the events from below. His face was hidden under the hood, and he seemed to turn into the void, asking if they were heard the rock approach. The air around him became thicker and was saturated with black. He looked at the hero, saying that they were given this world, but they did not even realize that they were under someone else's power. Overlooking his eyes around, his attention was finally focused on Brunetta and his comrades, which he awaits the moment when he hears their cries, and these cries are intended only for him. This awareness brought him an unrestrained joy that appeared in a bright smile. He seeks to destroy each student without leaving any alive. Stretching his hand is ready to blow. He continues to stand on the edge of the abyss, immersed in his reflections, contemplating only the future. At this point, the Academy students continued to celebrate the victory of the newly completed match, which triumphant Kyle Flavoire. The Academy proudly stood, wrapped in greenery that covered its walls as if it were an outfit. The very room is made of noble tree, combining skillfully dark and light shades. The window shows a lecture for students. In one hand, she held a chalk, which she wrote something on the board, and in the other, a textbook with educational materials, in parallel explaining something to students. Some students looked at the upper rows. Their emotions varied, but mostly on the faces was visible dissatisfaction, with an admixture of slight fear. It turned out that the reason for this was that Kyle and Sykes sat at the neighboring desks at the end of the class. Their tables were separated by a narrow passage between rows, so they were neighbors, but did not pay any attention to each other. Kyle, as always, sat with a slight smile, watching the teacher carefully. The girl is next to him, the same one who was in the tournament, stolen her gaze in his direction. Blondin stared at the teacher, crossing his hands on his chest. Today, a practical class will take place in the first floor class. Frey took the students outside, building them in front of metal structures. This is their first practical lesson, and she plans to start firing at one target. As it seemed, the first was tried by a little child who was crying during a duel between two guys. Taking that this clash arose through him, he pulled out a magic wand, shouted a spell, and saw with his own eyes that only a small stone flew out of it. Unfortunately, all the stones he managed to create could not fly a long distance and fall almost near him. No matter how much he efforts to hit the target, they flew in absolutely wrong directions, without following the trajectory he needed. The guy wept, realizing how pathetic he looks. Even with such an elementary task, it cannot cope, and it suppresses it. One of the students also tried to achieve the goal, but also failed. Suddenly, a loud noise, which stunned everyone around, forcing them to look back to the way from where these sounds came from. It turned out that these sounds created Blondin with Brunette. They stood quietly and released magic with powerful strokes without even effort. The soot on their faces testified that this task did not require them to do. Each of their blows aptly reached the chosen goal. The impact of the air and flames agreed in the center of a single target. Viewers, watching this conversation, exchange impressions about how much the characters were impressive. It is not surprising, because Sykes belonged to Class A. But the biggest surprise was that Kyle was not inferior to him. We can say that their power of influence was equivalent. One of the guys heard that their battle was still impressed by every witness. And, truth be told, they both acted at a completely different height. At this point, Kyle managed to give Sykes a valuable advice, to focus on strength, and he went on this advice. One of the students, covered by fear, doubted that they could ever reach their level. The recently cried young man was already wiped out of tears and watched in surprise what was happening. Next to him, a girl who recently sat at one desk with a blonde tried to create a water layer. However, its size turned out to be insignificant, and soon the bubble was peeled. Never limit yourself. Sykes concentrated, aiming at the incredible accuracy of the target. He appealed to him, exactly what he hoped for. He watched the edge of his eye for what the blonde did. As expected, its sensitivity to magic reached the highest level, and force, together with accuracy, significantly exceeded the indicators of any participant of Class A. The rounded structure on the pillar was scattered. Kyle, squeezing his magic wand, looked forward. He is the renown that he seems to be a little bent. If Sykes continues to study with him, Kyle is sure that he can surpass him. This was his goal. He did not look, and, calling him by his name, reported that the training and practice of long-range magic continued. However, there were no answers, because Blondin also turned loudly, attracting his attention. However, the child again ran to him with tears in his eyes, confessing that he could not completely manage magic. She begged Kyle for advice because she had completely lost hope. He greeted the deed and offered to try together. He leisurely revealed to the child that mastering spells involves several stages, but Brun no longer considered their conversation. Obviously, he was embarrassed or disappointed that he was interrupted, and he could not complete his opinion. A boy who had already pulled out a magic wand ran to them, trying to reproduce what Kyle explained. He wondered if he did everything right and whether his magic would fly straight. Kyle smiled, clasped in his palm, and said it turned out to be fine. However, he passed that the next time it was worth shooting in the very heart of the target. All other students struck it, and they grabbed their eyes. Over time, more and more people began to approach him for help. Many students surrounded him, wishing to get advice. Kyle assured that he would help everyone cope with this task. Frey, watching from the side, reminded the boys that she was actually her duty, because she is a teacher. However, for an unknown reason, everyone sought the help of Kyle, not her. At this point, the neglected brunette was already climbing the stairs, leaving the training ground. Frey noticed it, and called him in a question, wondering where he gathered in the middle of the lesson. He turned and explained to her that it was a lecture for beginners. All his students from the previous Class A have long mastered such elementary techniques. So, realizing that all this is well known to him, he decided that his presence here did not make sense. He is also not going to watch those who know nothing, slowly mastering the bases. His words were heard by a neighbor of the blonde, and she shuddered from these statements. Obviously, she perceived them at her own expense. She barely restrained her anger, looking at him boldly, going straight before her. Still, she was his teacher. The guy turned his head from the teacher again, intending to continue his journey. He did not have time for the role of the saint, so he decided to train on his own. He looked at Kyle, who at that moment was surrounded by students asking for help. At the same time, Press only honored her head, deciding to remain silent and not interfere with Sykes. Meanwhile, Blonde Woman continued to talk to other students, seeming to explain in detail what the task should start. The girl, with his fists clenched in his fists, focused on how the brunette is moving away. His words touched her soul too deep. In view of this, she came to the conclusion that if it continues to continue, it will become unnecessary. Obviously, she was very scared of a sense of selflessness for others. After classes, students gathered at the internal training ground. It was a garden with set targets both on the ground and in the air. Suspended goals were fixed on a glass dome. Inside, someone was constantly trying to call water balls. The girl was already panting, and sweat was generously flowing down her face. She pressed her hand against her chest, trying to even her breath. At that moment, she remembered how Kyle explained to others that the magic shot could be divided into 3 main stages. The first stage is the formation. The second is to charge the necessary magical energy to achieve the desired power. The third is the control of the magical shot. If at least one of these steps cannot be done correctly, the spell will not work. If the creation of magic is not as designed, it is worth reading the spell aloud, which will greatly facilitate the process. In this case, they will be able to succeed. When they impose a spell, it will connect them with an invisible thread of magical power. All they have to do is focus on the pursuit of the power to master this threat. If they do not forget about it, any spell will work. He acted as if he had a lecture for the students, and all the boys, hearing his explanation, greeted him with applause, thanking for his help. And the girl behind just watched him silently. She was now on the training field, trying to imagine a bullet from the water to fill it with magical power. To concentrate, the girl closed her eyes, creating a clear image in the imagination. She tried to call water to form a clot of liquid in the air. Suddenly, a small water ball arose in front of her, which she was delighted. She was convinced that this time she would inevitably succeed, but unfortunately, directly in her eyes, the ball flashed, spraying the water on all sides. Suddenly, the water from a burst ball splashed at the girl, lining her head and clothes, wetting everything around. Why is everyone around success, but only she can't handle it, even after explanations? This idea caused only tears of helplessness and misunderstanding of the situation. However, the girl remained in place, quietly flowing with tears. Suddenly, she turned and noticed that all this time someone was watching her. Kyle, leaning on one leg, as if preparing for a jump, noted that she did not quite cope. His appearance was not as if he wanted to make fun of her. The girl was impressed by his appearance. The tears of hail rolled across her face, heavier than before. She screamed in concern, finding out how long he was here. The guy, no word in response, stated that he's seeking to work out in this place, so he came here. He carefully put his bag on one of the benches and opened it. He pulled a towel out of the bag and, slightly smiling, stretched out his girl to wipe it out. He noted that before continuing the conversation, she had to take it first, because she was all wet after a water bullet burst on her. The girl sobbed disappointing, pressing the towel he gave her to her face. She was constantly thanked him. The cheeks were burning with shame and embarrassment. Arte. At this point, all her thoughts were spinning only around him. However, the guy again climbed into his bag and pulled out the usual portion of donuts from there. One of them he clamped his teeth, and the other reached out to the girl, asking if she does not want to taste. The girl, who still wiped his cheeks with a towel, was clearly surprised by such a proposal. She was most surprised how much he was able to fit in his bag. He dumped something uncertain, but the fact remained. His baggage looked suspiciously. Obviously, it was a secret to others, so he did not share these details with her. Oddly enough, the next thing he got was a tea service. Holding his teeth, he handed it to the other girl. In one hand he held a kettle, and in the other, a saucer with a cup. In his opinion, donuts are even more delicious with black tea. The girl could not understand how warm black tea was in his bag. However, it seems that she decided not to ask unnecessary questions, and in silence, drank a hot drink, plunging into carelessness. Both sat on a bench. The girl closed her eyes and finally felt pleasure in delicious tea, which she had just drank. Smiling, the guy noted that it was a very popular black tea imported by his father's company. For a moment, the girl froze and carefully put a cup on a saucer. She tilted her head, hiding her eyes under the bangs that fell on her forehead. Noticing this, the guy looked at her closely, but did not say a word, waiting for she to talk to the first. The girl confessed that she tried to follow all his instructions, but still considers herself absolutely hopeless. It seems that she is completely lacking in talent, and she will probably have to put up with it. The young man did not believe it was true. The girl believed that she was sorry, so she turned away from embarrassment and annoyance. It seemed a little more, and she would cry again, so she closed her eyes, trying to say something self-critical. However, the guy immediately retreated and began to deny everything he had just told her. It happened so unexpectedly that the girl turned to him with an expression of surprise on her face. He stood directly in front of her, squeezing his fists, and with a serious expression, he said that he had no pity. He sincerely believes that she has a talent. He asked if she would like to try again, because he really wanted to see it. For the first time, even a shadow of a smile left on his face. He was absolutely serious. The girl lost the gift of language from surprise, but quickly gave consent. The guy advised her to calm down first, and then try again. She agreed again, and did. However, she did not want to seem so helpless and powerless. This situation was incredibly embarrassed to her, because now she was left alone with him. The awareness of this made her even more turn red. And now not only cheeks, but even the forehead burned in bright red. She tried to calm down, realizing that she needed focus, otherwise she would not succeed. However, the excitement takes the mountain. It was felt in its sharp movements and facial expression. Closing her eyes, she shouted, causing a water ball. She managed to call the sphere of water, which was even slightly larger than usual. Katie looked at him with hope, thinking that everything turned out great. She had never achieved such success. Despite all the hopes of Hermes, the balloon still flashed, scattering the water. It surprised her even more, and she exclaimed from surprise. The girl could not understand why she repeated everything, if she had already performed everything perfectly. The guy looked at it with silent surprise. He noted that when she put her magical power, some other energy seemed to interfere in this process. Her water ball was shrouded in hundreds of lightnings and energy lines. Well, it's really interesting. Trying to understand, he wondered where this power came from. Looking at the sad and confused face of the girl, he finally realized what the problem was and what to correct. He quickly returned to his bag, which was inseparably lying on the bench. He unbuttoned the lightning and looked inside. The girl called him excitedly, but he remained silent. At that moment, he removed a small ring with a pebble in the middle. After showing her, he asked to wear. But when he returned to her, he carefully took her hand and put on her ring on her little finger. He realized that she had not yet mastered control of mania, so this ring was only a temporary decision. Subsequently, she had to try to apply the spell again. From the side, it looked like a suggestion of the hand and heart. The neck and ears of the girl were red. The realization that Kyle gave her a ring, she brought her out of balance, and she began to stutter. However, she assured that everything was fine, and she understood her task. However, only a fool would not pay attention to her face, which showed that it would be extremely difficult for her to focus now. However, collecting all her will in his fist, she pulled out a magic wand and created another ball from the water. This time the magic did not disappear, and the water ball remained whole. She kept her shape calmly. At that moment, Kyle realized that she was able to hold back her spell, and shouted to her that he needed to aim and release magic now. The girl, however, responded that she understood everything, waved a magic wand and let the water ball forward. She did it so sharply and vigorously that the shockwave pushed her body back. The water ball with a mighty blow hit one of the targets, which were fixed on the frame of the glass ceiling. Looking up, she realized that she still got into the target, and even from such a long distance, she immediately began to call her girlfriend to name. He, without spending time, began to support Katie, claiming that she had succeeded. The girl clearly enlivened. She wounded a little more. She seemed to ask him permission, perhaps hoping that he would remain nearby and watch her success. In fact, it was awakened in it. She looked so lively that the man, of course, allowed her to continue. After all, a gentle, friendly smile appeared on his face. The children did not notice how they watched the shadow from the training ground. This shadow belonged to the teacher. Watching them, she realized that you should no longer worry about Katie. However, the situation with Kyle demanded a deeper rethinking. She continued to follow them, smiling cunningly. She realized that Kyle was already overly affecting Class F, but it is still pursuing one unresolved problem. As soon as the mention of her flashed in consciousness, the smile disappeared from her face, giving way to a worry. The question that did not give me rest was a mental state. It was like a forest fire. Some trees ignited a fire above their peaks. The reason for all this was the fist of the young man, covered by a bright flame. He vigorously pulled his hand forward, then opened his fingers, releasing a fiery ball forward. However, its purpose was a massive tree trunk, which immediately flashed from a powerful blow. In his opinion, one thought was constantly spinning. This is not enough. His magic should be more powerful. After the battle with Kyle, he realized that he could not rely only on the sword forever. If so goes on, he will never be able to climb to the top. This year's extracurricular activity will be in the forest of demons filled with monsters, which are carried on all sides. Only one idea of it causes ants on the skin. Each of the students now works hard on themselves, seeking to get the pinnacle of their capabilities. Meanwhile, Sykes, remaining alone among the trees, improves their skills independently, trying to strengthen without assistance. Kyle tries to explain to other students what they should do and in what direction to move to become stronger. Recently, those who cried from impotence because they could not cope on their own now confidently shoot magic on the target. Everyone is trying to hide their true emotions, but during extracurricular activity in the Forest of Demons, everything will become obvious. 100 years ago, a dangerous dungeon was cleared thanks to the efforts of one of the academy teachers. He looked like a fairy tale character. An old magician was dressed in a long black mantle with a wide sleeve, with a beard and hair, white like snow. A hat wider than his shoulders flashed on his head. In his hands he held a long wooden stick, at the end of which a large stone was firmly fixed. He strongly made his way into the heart of the dungeon and, thanks to the artifact, successfully took him under his control. Thanks to his tireless effort, a dungeon appeared, completely subject to people. He created a magical seal with various patterns that played a key role in the formation of this dungeon. Since then, this dungeon has been used as a training arena for students. Today they have to overcome it. The elven teacher with a long braid, in glasses and elongated earrings in their ears told them. He had an extremely formidable look. At some point, as if trying to stun the boys, he loudly declared them that the place of their extracurricular occupation would be the Forest of Demons. Hearing this, the children were frozen in horror and panic. But not everyone felt the same. Kayla overwhelmed the delight of heard. Delia standing behind barely holding back tears. Katie looked a little surprised, obviously, not yet realizing that she heard. Additional classes are provided for all freshmen. The children were indignant because they would have to go to the woods of demons, because there were probably many powerful monsters. It seemed very tender. The Frey teacher assured them that you should not worry. Teacher Regith added that the dungeon is completely controlled by people. Initially, they will fall into a magical circle that will move them to a random place in the forest. Secondly, there is a mechanism in the dungeon that will throw everyone out again after 6 hours or after the boss. If they are seriously affected or surrendered due to insufficient amount of magical energy, they will throw them out of the forest as if catapult, having selected and taken away as far away from this place. The teacher reported that all actions would be fixed on his sleeve with the help of a special badge. When they win the monsters, they will receive additional points. At the end of the class, a list of the best students will be compiled, based on their achievements. In the case of first, second, or third place, they will be rewarded in the form of money, artifacts, and medals. Therefore, you should strive for the highest achievements. Children with delight received the news of cash, and Kyle was delighted with the opportunity to obtain artifacts. Under the influence of inspiration, Kyle immediately asked the teacher of reggae which artifacts they could get. Meanwhile, the Delia, who cried for him, was too excited to comprehend this issue, as did Katie, who also began to sob with the baby. Someone from the side exclaimed that Class F should not even dream of awards. Kyle instantly turned the noise, focusing on the one who said it. It turned out that it was one of the familiar Phoenix, the same one who left the scene with indignation at the end of their match. He was convinced that they could not have been waiting for them, because they would all reach Class A. The purpose was to touch students from another class. Kyle did not hear what he was told. He just smiled and waved the Turk with his hand, asking if he finally came to apologize to the deed. The girl who looked at him wept even more and shaking. Turk shouted that they were not going to apologize. Squeezing his teeth from rage, he thought that in Class F there was no chance of winning, but something did not give him rest. Near the tree, a little apart, he noticed a lonely shadow that turned out to be a Sykes. He did not pay attention to everything that happened, but thoughtfully turned his eyes, crossing his hands on his chest. Then he completely relaxed, closed his eyes, and leaning his back on the trunk of the tree, completely gave up rest. The Turk thought about what could happen to Sykes. He seems to have not yet realized that he found himself at the very bottom of the social ladder. However, only the young man himself considered it such a reality. He approached the old manor, almost whispering that Mr. Sykes himself was in front of him, who once belonged to Class A. After these words, Brunetta finally opened his eyes, paying attention to the whole around. So far, he cannot believe that, having a sword with him, he still was defeated by someone from Class F. He put his hands with his wickedness in his voice, squeezing his fists on his hips. He lifted his head, as if he had to be proud of. He stated that the class is now considered a second week. He may have to take responsibility. He seems to have stopped afraid of the brunette, and felt that he had the right to make fun of him now. The brunette immediately narrowed his eyes, seeking to scare the enemy, and even it seemed that the aura around him became gloomy black. Turk was immediately frightened and alert. He could not understand what this view means. Did Sykes intend to attack him? Suddenly, someone came behind and ordered the Turk to leave Brunei alone, arguing that, even if it is translated into the weakest class, it still comes from the family of high-ranking aristocrats. It was the third son in the Baron Holdenheim family, Caldura Holdenheim. His first element is the wind. This guy was distinguished by long white hair, and long earrings hung in his ears. He could see a long staff behind his back. He added that he may not have the power of the brunette, but the origin from the aristocratic family is still important. Sykes recognized Caldura without problems, but the expression of his eyes clearly testified that the meeting was not at all. The blond man, immediately grabbing his head, began to apologize for his words. However, it was clear from his face that he did not even think of sincere repentance. It was only a playful KPIN. Behind them, on the ruins of the destroyed structure, a mysterious person named Caldura sat. She warned him so that he did not put pressure on the sensitive point in the brunette. It was Garden Maltre, the second son of the Baron family Maltre, who possessed the elements of the earth. He stated that even if the brunette shows a good result, it would not change the fact that it remains weak. Garden's appearance suggested the bully. Sykes said his name, and his eyes were dissatisfied with the situation. Daly immediately stopped sobbing when he realized that all three leaders were standing in front of them. However, Blondin did not understand what three was talking about. It turned out that Sykes, Caldura, and Cardi are the best newcomers this year. However, because of the rivalry of their families, they do not get well with each other. The Garden is aware that Brunette also seeks to win the best reward, but hopes that he will forgive them. After all, they are tuned to the first and second place only for themselves, and have hope that it is clear to him. The Garden expressions were extremely rigid and humiliating. Comfort. The brunette closed his eyes again, saying that they would do what he pleases. It seemed that it did not bother him at all. Here Turk intervened again in the conversation, starting to laugh, because no one was in no hurry to help. He told the brunette to try to do something, because now he felt even weaker than in Class F. At that moment, Brunk squeezed his lips, obviously trying to hold back, but who knows? He may still express some sharp words in response. If Kyle did not go forward at that moment, it would be clear from his face. His mood was clearly deteriorating after he heard. Sykes was very surprised when he saw that a blond man decided to intervene in this situation. Garden, with unconcealed boredom on his face, turned to Kyle, asking if he really had any problems. Caldura looked at the blond man as if he was not here. Realizing that the situation could be more complicated, Delia and Katie began to worry. He said that he had no problems. He just seized something else. He replied that he went because suddenly his friend began to offend here. Hearing this, the psychic widened his eyes in surprise, and his enemies have become even more distrustful and dissatisfied. The land realized that Kyle decided to do as always, to defend others. He rushed forward, shaking a brunette, spreading his arms to the sides like a shield. Feeling that it was necessary to support, he realized that he should help. He loudly stated that he also did not intend to remain silent when they are so frankly smiling at his classmate. And saying these words, he did not stop crying. The brunette with a mysterious expression of the face was silently watching it. He noticed the children trembled with fear. Tuck laughed loudly, stating that weak creatures like to play friendship. Garden, a little lost, scratching his back, and Calliora only sighed quietly. Brunetta with a calm expression departed, stating that he was already enough. He asked them not to bother him. They can do anything at their own discretion, but it is no longer interested in it. Gael and Delia observed in silence how he was removing. Frey suddenly appeared, asking if they were going to argue for a long time. Regan also intervened in the conversation, managing to stand up to everyone before the magical circle. Finally, having collected all together, Elf announced the start of extracurricular activities for the first year. Freo smiled with his back. Several students have already been sent with a magical circle, and a warning about the endless invasion of monsters is constantly heard. However, this does not mean that you can avoid battles with them. A large number of students have already scattered around the forest. And so, in the queue, Kyle, which with the help of a peculiar magical catapult also found himself in one of the parts of this forest. Looking around, he saw amazing trees with mighty roots. He was amazed by the surprise. This forest belonged to the demons. The atmosphere was quite gloomy, which prompted alert. Closing his eyes, he decided to feel the magical power that enveloped him at first. Sleeping his hands to the sides and opening his palms, he used magic to create his own radar version. His mana created numerous circles that dispersed from him and penetrated further, covering the entire perimeter of the forest. At that moment, he realized that there were already monsters with whom they had managed to come together in the battle near him and some other students. Using his radar, he quickly realized that this magical source of power came from Katie. His capabilities are so significant that he was even able to see it in a clear defensive pose. Trying to approach her, he realized that she was a little further than he seemed, so he must hurry. Laying the reflections, he immediately rushed forward, at speed maneuvering between the roots of the trees. At the same time, Daly was next to two other guys. All three put their magic sticks forward, because a whole crowd of monsters had already gathered in front of them and had to defend themselves somehow. Of course, he was lucky to meet classmates, but the number of enemies around was striking. Did they really get directly into the epicenter of the monster den? It did not even need exaggeration, Ed. At least 20 different creatures struck the roots of trees right in their direction. His classmates realized that they could not give them advice. They urgently needed to retreat. They immediately unfolded and rushed to the other way to escape. From fear, the land could not be evaded, and stumbled against the thunder root of the tree, starting to fall. At the same time, one of the demons, similar to a wild wolf, have already opened a pashchek, ready to attack a defenseless baby. At that moment, as if from an explosion, his tears flooded his eyes. And every day he saw only a fire in front of him, which caused him a great surprise. A couple of boots stood right in front of him on the burnt part of the root. They belonged to Sykes, which surprised Delia. He sat on the ground with weeping eyes, dark-haired, holding a wand in front of him, as if trying to defend himself. He swore into the distance, and the infant at the very moment, without taking his eyes, watched him. Meanwhile, in the other part of the forest, thanks to a water ball, one of the monsters was already defeated. Kyle praised Katie for her brilliant work because she confidently hit the target. The girl agreed with him a little shy until he triumphed, with joy, his fists rejoicing in both. She turned to him with a smile, noting that he eventually saved her. After all, if he did not appear, she would definitely not cope herself. And Katya understood it perfectly. The blonde realized that staying alone in this forest is too dangerous, and Anthony came to the rescue. But he has not yet finished his opinion as he noticed the movement nearby. 3 boys rushed forward with shouts right behind the bushes, and Delia ran in front of them. Kyle called the baby, and he heard his voice, stopped. Flaville asked where the brunette is currently. The guy shared the words of the brunette, who promised to detain monsters on his own to provide them with the opportunity to escape. They listened to him and disappeared. While the other 2, based on the tree, tried to restore his breath, he continued to cry. The baby stretched his finger to the side from where they came from, and told Kale that the brunette was there. He also noted that there are many monsters, and expressed his hope that the dogs were intact. The boy clearly worried about him. Kyle used his strength again, directing it in the eye, as if trying to look into the space to understand what was happening to his new friend. It seems that he really noticed something dangerous. Instantly, without saying the words of the rest, he rushed to the side, and the child could only call him He raced hard, mentally praying that the brunette did not go away, because he had already rushed to her for help. The psycho was now in a terrible state. He seemed to be injured because he could no longer stand on his feet. His cloak was densely covered with spots. Flames and smoke balls raced around. The number of monsters nearby seemed to grow. The monster suddenly rushed at him, having managed to cut his clothes with sharp fangs and leave a deep scar on his shoulders. Despite the fact that the guy was confused, he was able to neutralize the monster, taking advantage of the force of fire. No matter how much they are destroyed, they are endlessly suitable, covering it on all sides. The wound was not only on the shoulders but also on the head. No matter what, he gathered all his will in his fist and decided to fight. Meanwhile, the blonde, trying to get to him as soon as possible, hurried to the rescue. Calling a fire arrow and aiming at one of the monsters, he simultaneously neutralized it. Pressing the painful shoulder, which sharply gave the pain, he reflected the monsters that continued to step on all sides. If the pressure is even stronger, his chances of victory will completely disappear. We need to detect the weaknesses and break through them. He noticed a gap in the front line through which he could pass, but his attention suddenly switched to a tree that pulled out with the roots before his eyes. Right in front of him stood a mighty demon, similar to a boar. It was an orc, and the ion was already approaching him. He threw a tree torn out of the root, but it only bounced from it. At the same time, the goblins, armed with the dubs, were ready to strike. He realized that the situation was even more complicated. He still couldn't avoid these blows, and was coughing with pain. Will it all end here? Will he shine himself again before the enemies, and become the object of mockery from the Kaluar garden? With these thoughts, he remembered how the land protected him in front of former classmates. He wondered if his comrades managed to escape and whether they were safe. Turning different scenarios, he found the strength to rise and continue the struggle. He felt more astonishment than worrying others in such a situation. It was extremely unusual for him. Once in the past, he remembered how he stood on the balcony next to his father, and he told him that he was the heir of the genus, so he should perceive the world differently than others, that he must be the strongest, and the only way to it should rise above everyone. As a child, words were etched to his consciousness, which determined his further load. He always sought to be the strongest among all. During clashes with others, his thoughts focused only on being higher and more powerful than his opponents. Once a Kyle put him in front of him, and when he won, he reached out of help generously. With a bright smile, he noted that together they can become even stronger. He was fascinated by his thoughts. He did not notice how two goblins creeped him and grabbed his hands firmly, as if gluing to the place. He was thinking about Kaldur and Garden, believing that all others were just steps on the way to its top. He was constantly approaching a huge bull, ready to strike. However, since the meeting with Kale, Katie, and Daly, something has turned into it, and he could not hurt why. This moment was circling in his head, like a daily cry. When the brunette decided to save him, running away, he endlessly thanked his friends for their support. Another stroke, and Brunetta, blinking on his back, began to flow blood. This is the end for him. He has already accepted this reality. However, even now it seems to him that everything is not so bad. The semi-consonant Sykes sat motionless, walking on the roots of the trees when the demon approached closer to it, swinging with his huge double. He seemed to be indifferent because he went too far. The monster never completed his attack because someone ahead of him. Sykes lifted his head surprised. Looking closer, he saw only one leg, and heard a voice that argued that he was too early to lower his hands. Kyle, standing nearby, waved his hand and addressed him. Delight was stunned by the unexpected appearance of Kyle and immediately asked why he was here. Calling to listen to the interlocutor, Blondin stared at one point, not blinking, with a removed face expression. It turned out that he noticed how seriously his friend was injured. He asked to trust him everything else. He is convinced that he is able to handle it on his own. His determination to protect a friend was adamant. He stared forward, focused on his task. Kyle, with a mighty power of magic, escaped forward, creating a powerful stream that rejected the monsters from his path and threw out from the place of the brunette sitting behind. Again, using the magical radar, he sought to determine the number of monsters around to prepare for the battle with them. He shouted into the sky, asking that the raining of his enemies took off from the winds of his enemies. The psyche drew attention to him when he, Blondin, directed a strong flow of magic forward towards the demons, using his magic wand. The horde of monster instantly disappeared under the shot of shots, leaving only black ash and smoke clubs. The brunette watched as he dealt with a large number of monsters in a moment. The magical power he possessed and where she could be, now she was most interested in. Suddenly, a noise came from the side, and the brunette turned to the sound. Two classmates whom they recently fled with turned it back in daily crying, throwing all their images on a brunette. The baby was screaming that he would also fight. However, when he stopped and shook his head, he realized that all the monsters had disappeared without a trace. Kyle boasted, they say. He won everyone. Next, while in a state of confusion, the psychic asked about the reason why they returned. Darlie, with tears in her eyes, begged for forgiveness, but they could not leave his friend in trouble and just escape. Hearing this, he took his breath. Because of his back, Katie suddenly appeared and stretched out to him. It turned out that it was a healing tincture. Thanks to her, after use, it will recover quickly enough. She said she could not help herself, so she decided to prepare even more evil. Surprised, Sykes took the flask that Anna handed over. The joyful Kyle noted that everyone was worried about him. It was for this reason that they went to the rescue. Earlier, he believed that even in the academy it was better to stay alone. Classmates are just a burden. He needs a strong opponent to compete. However, it seems that these thoughts were no longer disturbed. He smiled at the boys and seems to have first called someone friends. Continuing to rely on the tree trunk, he smiled and sincerely thanked for saving him. All three mastered a blush, and they radiated joy. For the first time, Daly saw a smile on her face. Kyle fascinated such changes. He reached forward, calling everyone to wait for psychologists to recover. Then, they will go to overcome the local boss. At first, the boys willingly agreed, but as soon as they heard about the boss, they were immediately frightened, and all their motivation evaporated. Meanwhile, in the heart of the forest, a garden named Caliora asked whether the monsters seemed strange to them. Unfortunately, his friend confirmed that he was not mistaken, though it seemed full of nonsense. After all, there were two monsters capable of absorbing magic. On the field, among a large number of trees, one could see how several students began a fight with two giant demons. People hid behind the bushes nearby and were quietly talking to each other. They wondered that someone had already started a battle with these monsters. Could these two creatures be the forest leaders? However, it was hard to believe that there could be two bosses in this dungeon. When they looked more closely, they understood from the hints of the garden and the heat, which they fought next to them by the students of Class A. Blondins with indifference stated that, in this case, it would be easy for them to cope with these two monsters. At this point, Kyle interrupted him, denying that it was not, but immediately noted that the case is not so simple. Sykes looked at him in surprise and, puzzled, wondered what he was in mind. These two monsters were somewhat reminiscent of people in their body structure, but they were significantly outweighed in muscle mass and growth. Their long white beards and huge fangs, combined with horns on their heads, made them look like demons. Large stones were attached to the chest. Class A students were noticeably exhausted and wounded. On their faces, it was impossible to determine whether fear or just annoyance. Sykes and Kyle continued to watch the events from below. Garden, shouting, lifted his axe high above his head, jumped rapidly and hit one of his bosses into his shoulder. The stone that was on his chest shone, as if repelling. The guy, twisting, flew away. Everything happened exactly as he expected, but he still decided to check his terrible suspicion. Jumping closer to Caliora, he turned to him loudly. He immediately realized what was meant, and agreed. Now he was convinced that they were able to absorb magic. The classmates who were behind were urging them to help them by releasing water and fireballs towards the bosses. However, Kalura only called them fools, because they were clearly lacking in understanding the situation. Each blow just dissolved in the air without harming these two monsters. On the contrary, every time they seemed to enjoy it even more. Their smile became more and more sinister, and a dangerous shine was lit in his eyes. Blondin reached forward and ordered not to use magic against them, arguing that they only acquire from it. Classmates could not understand whether he really was talking seriously. The blonde woman was in a dead end, not knowing how to proceed in this difficult situation. They used magic sticks as weapons, but were only able to fight their body with magical energy. If he tries to impress them only with a spear, he will practically do no harm to the monsters. The same thing will happen if Garden uses its axe, as if it is a regular weapon. Now they are actually unarmed and helpless before these bosses. They do not imagine how to overcome the killers of the magicians. The boys froze in place, aiming at weapons to the monsters, and they think about how to act in this situation. Kyle, comforting in the bushes, said he suspected it. But now he finally became convinced that these monsters really absorb magic power. Sykes exclaimed that it was simply incredible, where such a monster could appear during additional classes. Daly and Katie were numb by surprise when hearing it. Sykes realized that, despite all their efforts, if nothing to do, Kalura and Karzenin would not cope with these monsters alone. Suddenly rose up from the bushes, he strongly moved forward. He was surprised to ask if he was going to help them. But only recently they laughed at him, humiliating him in the eyes of everyone. Brunette assured that only acts on the guidance of a decent heir of the Deli family. This is his duty as one who rises above others. Hearing these words, the Trinity was very surprised and even a little lost. In fact, Kyle did not expect anything from him, but asked to wait a little. He wants to return something to him. However, Brunetta did not quite realize that he had to return, because nothing seems to be guilty. Clearing the space in front, he began to look carefully there. Kyle took out the weapon and handed it to Brunette. He immediately recognized his own sword in his hands. Is everything already corrected? He scratched his head and confessed that he was not ready to return it. It remains to perform a small refinement. He could not understand that he was still slipping out of him. When he pulled the weapon out of the vagina, she immediately shone, radiating such powerful magic that even his cloak lifted back under the gust of the wind. Kyle said he should share the strength with the spirit that lives inside the sword, and only then will he be able to become stronger than ever. A magical creature suddenly appeared ahead. The guy with his eyes extended closely watched the events. There is a real fire dragon ahead, which can produce a blue flame. If he recognizes it with his master, he will be able to conquer this magical creature and master her true power. Tyle explained that it is too strong at the moment, and even clairvoyance may face difficulties. However, but not paying any attention to it, stood with a sword raised up. Due to his own weakness, this sword was injured, and he, closing his eyes, apologized. He recognized his weakness and superiority, but promised to strengthen. Like its weapons, it will certainly change. Raising his hand with his sword, Brunette asked permission to lend force in his weapons. He exclaimed that he swears that the sword would witness his growth and power. Just in front of him, the dragon stood, and the memories of new friends who supported him in a difficult hour suddenly came to life in his mind. He felt her power. The fire dragon wrapped his body, taking this burden. The blurred eyes did not prevent him from becoming more stable, holding the sword in his hands. The flame of the dragon covered it, wrapping it with warmth. He mentally turned to his fiery companion to give him strength again. When he opened his eyes, he saw sparks that shimmed around. Did it mean that the dragon still recognized him? When he looked forward, he was waiting for a familiar sight. Kyle stretched his hand, asking if he would join them. And of course, the brunette simply could not answer otherwise than agreeing. A powerful explosive feedback broke out in the air. Garden with a frantic force hit the tree trunk, so much that he even released his charming weapons, an axe. Faced with a cough, blood flowed from his mouth and his eyes became white. Kaliura called him, trying to shout, but no sound came out of her throat. His companion could no longer fight. Still, without losing hope, the blond man roared in battle with a cry, realizing that his chances of victory were not too high. In fact, it turned out to be true when the spear stopped at a millimeter from the face of the monster, as if there was an invisible obstacle between them, preventing him from moving forward and harming him. The monster only absorbed his magic, becoming more powerful. Gathering enough strength, he threw away the blonde to one powerful blow, so he released a spear and flew back. Other students, impressed, watched Mr. Kaljur with open mouths, trying to shout something in his direction. Desperately trying to get out of the ground with the help of hands, the blonde trembles. He remained the only one who still tried to warn the boys to run away from this place. His forces were on the verge of exhaustion. He lifted his head, clapping one eye, and looked at them. From his forehead a bloody trickle flowed. He was beaten well, but he still told others to run until there was such an opportunity. Having said these words, he fainted, and Garden fell to the ground again. On all sides, the students shouted, trying to attach two classmates, and hurried to them. One of them tried to lift Mr. Garden, who was crying desperately, and in no way could grasp what was happening. The second, throwing a blonde-in hand on his shoulder, also could not understand that it was in this extracurricular lesson that went wrong. There was no need to warn this in advance. So why did they need these badges that hung on them for tracking? Mr. Kalira clearly weighed more than him, so the boy barely managed to keep him in order not to fall to the ground. They were able to raise their comrades from the ground. However, The bosses have not disappeared anywhere, and now waved the sticks to neutralize other children. They could not believe that it was happening. They are the strongest in Class A. At that moment, the monster trembled. It became obvious to them that something unusual was happening to them. 2 pairs of boots were relentlessly approaching them. Another moment goes away, and children from Class A together with 2 bosses of the dungeons were separated by joy and taste, but still ready to protect others. Former classmates of the brunette could not hide their astonishment, seeing him in front of him. However, he urged them to go back. Kale turned with a smile, reassured them, and asked not to worry, allowing them to deal with the situation on their own. Someone was interested in where the class of F people came from, how children who came with these boys helped to lift the wounded from the ground. The man who held the hook in his arms clasped his teeth with a focused expression. He, without a doubt, considered something important, weighing whether he should tell him. Nevertheless, he shouted loudly to the one who stood in front that the superiors were absorbing magical power directly in their eyes and urged to be careful. The boys came back to look at him. Kyle winked slightly, smiling widely, and assured that they knew it, but still thanked for the information provided. At this point, when he watched one of the boys, one of the bosses was already approaching, waving his stick. At the same time, the PSIK noticed this, and without delay, turned to Blondin, trying to draw his attention. Despite his powerful blow, he was able to repel a huge boss. Everyone who witnessed this scene could not hide their astonishment. The student's F student with his bare hands stopped the attack of one of the bosses. Struck demons to the edge. Full of anger, they appeared all their rage. Kyle struck his fists against each other, accepted the battlefield, and, contacting 2 monsters, asked if they wanted to dance with him. At this time, in the control room of the dungeon, teachers watched what was happening in the demonic forest, using many screens and students' icons. Their attention was attracted by 2 bosses, which they noticed on one of the cranes. In addition, there is a significant problem. The injured students are not evacuated. This is an obvious failure in the system. In addition, there were monsters that absorb magic. Teacher Reged was in full confusion. Turning, he turned to Frey, asking if she could somehow be involved. However, he did not have time to finish his question when he suddenly heard the cries. Everyone returned and saw Frey try to break the invisible obstacle. She was able to leave several dents on it, but it was not enough for the strength. She was in February anger. Her face was overwhelmed by anger. At this point, Kyle struck his enemy, a 6's, holding his sword with alert and directing him to the monster. Frey explained to everyone that now teachers are surrounded by a barrier that they will not be able to overcome. Others approached her, asking again, because they cannot believe it. Their voices sound uncertain. She turned to the rest and explained in detail to avoid any misunderstandings that there should be ordinary monsters in the boss. Even she would not dare to find something as strange as a monster capable of absorbing magic, especially for freshmen. The young teacher in glasses, in surprise, asked where these monsters came from. In their situation, there can now be only one answer. Someone intentionally separated the students, replacing them with such complex monsters. The teacher in glasses again turned to Frey, saying that she was using magic to bring out all the students from there. However, she has already tried to do it a dozen times, but the artifact in the center of the forest is absolutely not reacting. Frey began to swear. Her patience was on the verge. She could not allow it to be part of the history of their academy. She tried to strike a new strike in places where small dents in the barrier have already appeared. She ordered Rogov to continue sending the teams to the artifact until she was trying to break through the barrier. Meanwhile, the young girl in glasses called Frey, and the Elfian, having heard this call, ran to execute the assignment. She mentally apologized to her students. In such a difficult situation, it is not good to shift responsibility for them. However, as long as it rests from disruption, it has no other way out. The paintings of what happened in the dungeon changed on the screens along with images on brooch. Among them, one of them showed a shiny smile of Kyle. Frey, condemning herself to close one eye, focused on it and realized that at this moment he could only rely on him. The only hope for the rest was Kyle. At that moment, a guy with blonde hair tirelessly attacked a monster. Without any weapons, it was the only way they could overcome this creation. He hit the stone in the middle of his chest, and noticed how magical circles began to radiate from him. This sight made a great impression on him. Even the smallest part of the magic in the attack, it absorbs due to the crystal in the chest. These monsters were created artificially, and he quickly understood it. However, He has several ways to destroy these demons, and now he has chosen which it will apply this time. His body has frozen in a tense position until it penetrated magical force into each cell of his skin. No spark of this power could be allowed to break out, at least for a moment. It was necessary to accumulate it in the muscles and bones to give yourself incredible power. Based on one leg, he rushed forward, heading as one of the monsters who were already waiting for him. He decided to go exactly on the crystal in the center of his chest, being sure that it would be the right solution. From the first blow, he hit the target, and, not meeting any resistance from the side of the monster, he, not even having time to evade, unexpectedly received a powerful blow that made the stone crack and crumble on debris. At the same moment, Blondie used the brown fist, splashing all the magical forces that remained in his body. The bright light rushed from the body of the monster, as if it had ignited it from the inside. Everyone around could not hide their surprise. He overcame with his bare hands. Just imagine, without any weapons, he managed to defeat such a powerful creature. Dale stopped for a moment and turned, hearing an unusual noise. It turned out that the cry came from one of the monsters, to which Sykes cut his shoulder with a sword. But after a moment, the wound lit up and began to tighten. Sykes noticed this, realizing that even if he struck the sword, he quickly recovers. His sword has changed and now shines with magical power. Now it is impossible to remove it. And what to do in such a situation now? From where he was called, and he immediately turned his head to the sound. Kyle decided to tell him about the ability of the monster to absorb magic, which was not guarded by half of his huge reserves. Blondin advised to release all his magic to freedom without holding it back. The brunette was extremely surprised by this decision. Daryl immediately began to fall asleep. I can't figure out the course of Kyle's thoughts. Does he not absorb all this power as soon as the dogs release it? Brunette was thinking that the monster is not a rival for him, and that he needed to release his strength. However, he still decided to trust Blondin's words, and replied that he was aware of what to do. To overcome the monster, you must first apply a physical attack. First, you should cause damage to the crystal and then complete the match with magic, as it recently showed others. However, there is another way that is perfect for magicians. Sykes bent the sword, preparing for a blow, and again called on the mighty spirit that was in his blade to absorb his magical power. Every day he noticed that the blue flames gradually covered the psyche. The brunette asked to answer his challenge and fight with the spirit together, side by side. He realized that solving the problem lies on the surface and is extremely simple. He used a storm of magical power. Thanks to the dragon, he released the unrestrained flow of flames. Such a force that even a crystal built into the body of a monster will not be able to absorb everything completely. The Psyche, when making his latest efforts, shouted without drawing his eyes from the enemy's face. He powerfully put the sword forward and released a huge wave of flames, which with a roar rushed to the magical creature, accurately involved in the target. The fiery dragon flew over the battlefield, and the shockwave was so strong that the children who stood nearby were flying. There was only one black shadow among the flames and smoke, the brunette, which squeezed a burning sword in his hands and waited closely to the result of his attack. However, he was able to overcome this monster. Casturing from joy, Daly rushed to them with outstretched arms, shouting that they were just amazing. What they were, well, because they overcame such mighty monsters on their own. Sykes remained silent and did not express any emotions, listening carefully to the child. It was strange to think about Kyle, and it made him think. Students who have been exhausted or injured were not suffered. Moreover, the features of these monsters and the lesson were not organized by teachers. There are too many problems that they really do not like to deal with. Blondin suddenly felt something nearby and turned his head with fear. A powerful blow flew directly to him, but he managed to repel him. It was a huge wave of flame that would hit the target if he did not respond on time. In order to protect himself, he created a wall of wind and water, however. To a great surprise, the impact of the enemy was able to break through this protection. The others asked the question of what it was. Two palms were applauded as if they were greeted with success. From there, a magician came out like a shadow that recently watched the battle of Kyle and Sykes from the mountain cliff. All four were surprised to look at him, as if gradually reaching the awareness of everything. Kyle wiped a smile from his face and asked who this man was. Instead, with a bad smile on his lips, he extended his palm, in which a black magic ball was stuck. It turns out that before Grieve, he has not shown everything yet. Having stretched his hand compressed into his fist, he began to release black magic, which flew in the air and formed a black dome above them. Kyle instantly realized that most likely it was a shadow barrier. Now even the teachers who finally got to them are powerless to help children. Now the sorcerer was ready to start his mysterious action. From the depths of the earth began to emerge bones resembling human hands. The children looked with horror without taking their eyes. He smiled satisfied, hiding his face. It was obvious that what was happening brought him great pleasure. So far, Kyle kept extraordinary endurance and watched silently for the actions of the man standing before him. In a moment they were already facing the army of skeletons. Some of them were in armor and with weapons in their hands. At first glance there were at least 20. However, the brunette later noticed that there were not only skeletons. In the heart, behind the back of the magician, someone spread very powerful softly. This was more reminiscent of the anthill. Of all the corners of the forest, the gloomy magic seems thickened at one point, forming the shape of the pyramid. A huge skeleton stood directly in front of them. His neck and arms were decorated, and a crown sparkled on the skull. He was dressed in a black hoodie, which instead of fur had small skulls on the collar. The magician decided to introduce children to this mysterious creature. He called this creature the Lord of the Dead, the King Ghost. Katie and Daly, covered by anxiety, kept nervously for their mouths and neck, making strange sounds. In a moment, the boys fell to their knees, starting to cough, and the rest watched in surprise, not realizing what happened to them. Sykes was not in the best situation and tried to cover his nose and mouth with a sleeve. He suggested that the boys came under the influence of Mias, which is spread by the King of the Dead. In her look, horrible as a glow, the lights that were smoldering in empty sockets were visible. Kyle, surrounded on all sides by skeleton warriors, did not take his hard eyes in one direction. Megras protected, feeling that he was already in his pocket. He wanted to hear how they shouted their last shooters. Ready to defend himself, Delight was worried when he noticed how many skeletons he was approaching him. He lifted the sword, preparing to repel, but suddenly his face twisted in amazement. Just a wall of light appeared before him. The magician was stunned, because he could not understand where such magic of light could arise here. It was a complete surprise for him. However, the situation cleared when everyone noticed how Kyle, a white glow, was approaching directly to the King of the Dead. He stated that he was indifferent to who this king is, but there was something that he could not close his eyes. The most important thing in this situation was that he decided to threaten his friends. Hearing this, Brunette stared carefully in the direction of a friend who approached the monster every step. Kyle, splashing his hands like a sorcerer, suddenly released a powerful stream of light from his palms. His gaze crawled madly, and at that moment, he resembled rather a madman than a regular first-year student. He said frankly that he was not going to be polite with such people. Hearing these words, the magician looked at him with a strange expression, apparently not understanding what was happening. The man laughed loudly and boldly, laughing at Kyle, and, without reducing the tone, asked what he would do next. His army of skeletons and the undead lined him in front of him, and behind his back stood the King himself. Sleeping his hands and pointing to the army of inanimate skeletons that appeared before him, the man in the raincoat was loudly and boldly asked Kyle that he could do when he was facing a whole army of the undead. Sykes, Delia, and Katie froze in place of surprise, looking at the army of the undead, and just couldn't find words. However, it was then that Kyle returned to the man in a mask and said he was thinking about how to get rid of so many enemies. Kyle gathered magic in his palms, concentrating all their power in his fists. From there, from a lot of energy, his fists shone with bright light. Kyle stood ominously, looking intently at the enemy, putting all his strength in his own hands. Kyle very seriously turned to a man in a raincoat, urging him to destroy the whole army with one blow. Hearing these threatening words, the man in the raincoat clenched his teeth from rage and annoyance. Silent, the army of skeletons and the undead moved forward, gradually reducing the distance to Kyle with the swords, shining with his power. Among them, a man stood out in a cloak, which was held in his hand, and laughed loudly. He smiled at Kyle's words, asking with irony whether he was really going to destroy everyone with one blow. Then the man in a fragny jacket laughed loudly, saying that Kyle was just a little boy. Preparing for the attack of Kyle and focusing in his hands, he looked closely at the man in the cloak and, without tearing away from him, asked whether he was aware of the weakness of inanimate creatures. The man in the raincoat barely pulled his lips from the excitement. After that, Kyle put his hands on the ground, directing his energy through it. At that moment, under the feet of the army of skeletons and the undead, the earth sowed with the light of his strength, and magical patterns appeared on its surface. The entire legion of skeletons and the undead was freezing in real estate inside the magical circle, and among them was King Doors, along with mysterious figure in the cloak. This hidden in the cloak, the man looked closely at the place where the magical circle was drawn, managing the whole army of the inanimate. The man in the cloak was frozen with surprise, realizing that Kyle was able to create a magical circle. Only instantaneousness, and the place where everyone was present was manifested by the Kylov circle. Then Kyle turned to his friends who stood stunned after their fight. He smiled kindly and asked them to look like nothing had happened. At the same moment, the whole army of the undead was captured by sacred magic, among which only the king climbing and a man in the cloak remained in the arena. They looked stunned at Kyle, waiting for the following events. Kyle, looking at them, announced that he said goodbye. Subsequently, Kyle invented the name for his spell of the Holy Land, after which the magical circle shone even brighter. The man in the cloak tried to stop it with the help of his rod, but he was not enough for his strength. Subsequently, the magical circle flashed a bright glow that destroyed the army of the undead and the king lychee inside. Then the sacred circle went out, suddenly leaving a light smoke. Subsequently, Kale's ability to admire and great emotions, stating that he had managed to destroy the whole army of the undead with his spell. Katie, on the contrary, tears rolled from excess emotions. She only crossed her hands on her chest. She thanked Kyle for saving them all again. Kyle, satisfied with his achievement, silently enjoyed the moment, smiling easily. Sykes stood silently behind Kyle, watching his back. He looked at Kyle shrilly, sighed strangely, and reflected on how far he still seems to him. After all this, Kyle returned to the man in the raincoat and told him that he was overcome by his servants. He then asked what steps he planned to take on. Initially, the man in the cloak remained indifferent. However, he later smiled in response to Kyle's words. Suddenly, it was at this moment, next to Kale, the earth suddenly exploded from the unbearable heat. From under the place where the earth split, the giant bone hand of the king lich began to appear. This unexpected maneuver of the man in the cloak struck Sykes, and he exclaimed. King Lech began to rise from under the ground using his long, bony hands. When he completely found himself on the surface, his eyes glittered ominously. The king lich quietly, but terribly warned everyone that the magic of such a level would not affect him. The surprised Sykes looked at the king lich without realizing what was happening, while Dela and Katie read fear, and they were waiting for his next actions. The man in the raincoat stopped in front of Kale and turned to him, saying that he possesses a great magic. The cloak continued, noting that even a dozen priests would not be able to use light magic on this scale. The man in the cloak looked at Kayla, who was motionless, immersed in reflection on his future plans. Smiling ominously, the man in the cloak with a shade of mockery said that it was a pity that Kale's spell could not help them. The man in the cloak stood with a staff in his hands and spread his hands, pointing to the king lich who was behind him. He smiled ominously and laughed, saying that Lord of the Undead indifferent to the magic of Kyle. Dale stood next to him, and he turned to Sykes with excitement and fear, asking if even Kyle would not really be able to overcome it. Katie joined him, trying to encourage rapid objections, claiming that the man in the cloak was only bluffing. Sykes did not answer them with a word, only surprised. The words were heard in his head. When a person with a powerful magical power takes death and darkness into his heart, he turns into a lich. However, among them, someone else was much more powerful than a regular lich. Sykes looked at the Lord of the Undead and could not believe that they were faced with a legendary monster from Legends. The magical aura of the undead was gloomy, ominous, and poisonous. It gradually began to spread through the forest, and with its invasion everything around, trees and vegetation, began to rot under the influence of this dark magic. Having stated this, the path exclaimed the thing, informing everyone that the forest was beginning to rot. Kate looked on the trees that were slowly decomposing in their eyes and, in a panic, shouted, covering her face with her hands. At that moment, the man in the cloak began to laugh loudly and mock the children, stating that soon their bodies would decay. Suddenly, the earth exploded near the Lord of the Undead, through which he spread his magical power. Lord of the Undead felt it and was surprised. The owner of the Undead, saying in his ominous voice, told the man in the cloak that his magical power was under suppression. The man in the mask was extremely surprised and, not believing in his ears, asked again. While the bishop of the undead and the man in the cloak had yet to understand what was happening, Kyle approached them and calmly explained that he had created a barrier. He did not want the owner of the undead to cause new destruction. With a smile on his face and winning the inanimate lord, Kyle asked him to demonstrate all his mighty magic. The ruler of the dead stunned the words of Kyle and his unexpected reaction to the whole situation. Sykes, Delia, and Kate could not look away from Kyle. Their eyes were surprised to be surprised because of his amazingly similar reaction. The masked man looked more closely at Kyle, amazed at how he could smile in such a situation. The man in the cloak, looking at Kaylee, who smiled, wondered if he had any problems with his head or something else. Kyle stood quietly with a smile, holding a small wooden stick in front of him. However, soon the owner of the undead agreed with Kyle and assured that everything would happen at his request. Then he focused all his dark power in his hands and called on darkness with her spells. The evil responded to the call, turning into fire and covering the enemy's flames. At that moment, the man laughed in the cloak, stating that this dark fire would not go out until he destroyed everything he touched. He looked at Kyle and brutally stated that he would not have a bone when he burned. However, at this point, neglecting all the words that they were addressed to him, Kyle lifted a small wooden stick. Those who noticed his movement immediately fell silent, looking carefully at him as well as his friends. Suddenly, feeling something unusual above, the man in the cloak and the Lord of the Undead made his eyes to where Kaylova was indicated by a small wooden wand. They saw a gigantic light bullet on the top. A mysterious stranger in a mask watched a bullet with misunderstanding, thinking about its purpose. Meanwhile, Kyle, who stood nearby without lowering his hand that pointed up, explained that he had collected an inexhaustible magical force from the Holy Land at one point. The man in the cloak could not take his eyes off the ball, standing silently, asking himself how Kyle was able to concentrate so much magical power in one place. The owner of the undead directed his gaze on a shining disc and caused dark magic. The owner of the undead ordered the dark forces to absorb the light that he so despised. Then he concentrated all the black flames in his palm, creating a ball from them. He directed it directly to a light object. The Dark Lord of the Demons boldly released a fiery volley towards Kale's light bullet, accompanying it with a cursed fire. The damn ball was rushing to the light sphere at incredible speed. All Kayla's friends, stunned, looked up, watching what was happening. Among them was a man in the cloak, watching the events carefully. When the fascinated ball almost caught up with light, it shined extremely bright. Suddenly, the light ball turned into a pillar of light, and without unnecessary effort destroyed a dark damn ball that was flying towards. At the same time, under the bright and powerful wall of light, the owner of the undead was captured, which suffered significant damage. Under the influence of this blinding glow, all Kayla's friends, along with her husband in the cloak, covered their faces with their hands to protect their eyes. Within a few moments, the majestic pillar of the light ball dissolved in the air, leaving no trace. But by this time, Kyle and his friends were already lying on the ground, as were the man in the raincoat. The owner of the undead was overthrown under the pressure of highlight magic. The dark dome that kept them in sharpening also disappeared, releasing the rays of bright radiance inside. Kale's friends, covering his face from the bright sun, watched as the dark barrier dispelled thanks to a column of light. Delia and Katie, seeing what was happening. Where previously the owner of the undead stood, there is now a small black ball, shrouded in dark energy. Kyle carefully took her in his hands, carefully examining from all sides. Considering the dark ball in the hand of Kyle, he noted that the King had died, and only the nucleus remained from it. Then Kyle addressed the man in the cloak and stated that he would ask him the question again. The man in the cloak clenched his teeth from irritation. He looked silently at Kyle. Kyle, with a barely noticeable smile, asks what he plans to do next. The man in the cloak stood and froze sweating, nervous, reflecting the recent events that unfolded in his eyes. He reflected deeply how a huge magical circle of light magic in seconds destroyed the army. Recalling the spell of the light pillar, the man in the cloak was surprised to realize that Kyle burned the King of the Count with only one spell. The man in a cloak, filled with horror, looked at Kyle and thought that he had never heard of such a monster as Kyle at the academy. Kyle, calmly and with confidence, stood in front of him. He asked the man in the cloak what are his further actions and whether it was all that he was capable of. At that moment, the man in the cloak, sitting on the ground with his head lowered, suddenly felt his left hand. Paying attention to the trembling, he swore and grabbed his left hand firmly, trying to stop the trembling. The man in the cloak began to get annoyed and in surprise asked himself why he was still trembling. He grabbed his head. He asked Kaylee annoyed how his name was, but Yarrow thought. The hero remained silent. Kyle, standing in front of him and putting his hands on his hips, calmly replied that he was called Kyle Flightly Field, and he is currently studying at the first year of the Academy of Magic. Hearing Kyle's answer, the man grabbed a small stone in the cloak, and with a clear annoyance in his voice, assured that he would remember it. Kyle looked at his opponent in surprise. Kyle focused on a small stone in his hands, believing that it is a stone for teleportation. At this point, the man in the cloak crushed a small stone of teleportation, going to disappear from sight. But Kyle responded lightly, not wanting to allow a suspicious stranger to escape so easily. Kyle instantly grabbed his left hand, aiming her as if weapons on a man in a raincoat. The shot is magically striking the target. A man in a raincoat, he is not able to teleport more, loses balance and falls on the ground with a roar. Kyle, watching her husband, decided that he needed another shot. But at that moment the stranger in the raincoat, competing with instability, rejected the hood and showed his face. Kyle simply did not look away from him. The man in the cloak that hid his face was almost a peer of Kyle and his friends, with the same bright hair as Kyle. The stranger in the cloak turned to Kale, warming his face loudly, because their paths would intersect. Kyle stared carefully at his face, silently studying the features. The man in the cloak threw the hood, and holding his head through him, he shouted annoyed to Kyle that next time it would be his end. In a moment he disappeared instantly, teleporting in an unknown direction. Kyle and his friends froze, staring at the place where the man had previously stood. Each of them plunged into their own thoughts. Kyle, meanwhile, remembered the man's face in the raincoat and became interested in what he was strange magical stones on his head, which he had never heard before. While Kyle was thinking about a stranger in a cloak, Delia, excited and tears in his eyes, came to him. She hugged him firmly, expressing deep gratitude and claiming that he had saved them all. Katie joined them, as emotionally interested in Kyle how they could thank him. Kyle, with a smile on his face, clumsily answered everyone that they were glad that they were all safe. At this point, Sykes also approached them silently. Suddenly, teachers came up from afar, wondering if they were all right. She looked very disturbed. Kyle instinctively covered his friends, hiding them behind his back, and with anxiety called the Frey teacher. Suddenly, the dealer came out of Kyle, explaining that Frey's teacher had been injured. Frey reassured them, saying that everything was fine with her, and was truly glad that everyone remained unharmed. Teacher Regith had just crossed the Freya teacher, and immediately asked Kyle if someone else came here except for them. Kyle calmly answered the teacher of the regatta that probably the whole situation is the anticipation of the man in the cloak, but he was able to slip. Teacher Regat, surprised, asked him again. Kyle pointed out the homeless monster and informed the teachers that he seems to have turned all these monsters in the cloak. The amazed teachers looked in the direction he pointed to. The teacher Regat, noticing numerous monsters, asked Kyle with surprise whether he was really able to overcome all these creatures. He then added that these monsters absorb magic. Kaylee, smiling, confirmed his words that together with Sixa they defeated all these monsters. Teacher Regat turned to Sixa with distrust, asking if it was true, which he nodded in agreement, confirming Kyle's words. Teacher Regan was surprised and asked everyone as they did it. But he was interrupted by Teacher Frey, reminding that it is more important to take care of students. But suddenly at this moment huge white arrows, reinforced by magical power, began to be released in the forest. Teachers and all others were fascinated in the forest. And here's a reggae teacher with a joyful smile announced to everyone that the forest finally started working. Teacher Rezigid declared everyone that the injured students were taken out. At this point, Sixa shuddered white magic, which lifted him to the sky. Everyone watched him with surprise. Sykes calmly told everyone that his magical power seemed to have exhausted. Then, apologizing, he said that he would go first. When Sykes was ready to fly first, suddenly stopped Kyle, grabbing and preventing a detachment from the ground. Delia and Katie remained stunned by Kayla's act. Sykes and Kyle sat on the ground, canceling the spell. Delia was surprised by Kyle what he conceived. The teacher also asked Kyle as he was able to cancel the refund and was quite surprised. To which Kyle easily replied that he would later discuss it with the teachers. He then noted that there were many events today, but even in such a situation, everyone was united and coped with challenges. Kyle noted that he was thinking about returning with the whole company and discussing all the events that have taken place. Kyle shone from these words and hurried to turn to the Rego teacher for permission. But the teacher of the regiment, without convincing, strictly replied that he would in no way allow it, because there was still plenty of monsters in the forest. The teacher Regat turned away from Kyle, who tried to persuade him again, and, creating a small magical circle on his palm, lifted him to his ear, informing that he would contact the headquarters to allow all students to return. The Frey teacher appreciated the situation, looked at Kyle's friends, and asked if they wanted to return with him. The Land and Katie stared at her. When a phraseology teacher asked if someone wanted to join Kaylee, Katie gladly replied that she was looking forward to it. Delia joined her with a smile, adding that she also wanted to return with everyone. Then Freya's teacher turned to Sykes, wanting to hear his opinion. She looked at him with unconcealed seriousness. Psychologists responded with full seriousness that if it were not for the presence of Kyle, they would no longer be among the living. At this point, the Land and Katie persistently persuaded Regith teacher to release them all together. Sykes supported them, noting that Kyle also believes that they should return together. Teacher Frey noticed a barely noticeable smile on Sykes' face when he stated that he had no right to give up Kyle's offer. Frey looked at him with surprise, thinking that she had never seen such an expression before his face. Teacher Frey remembered how Kyle said on him. She thought that it may have been her selfish desire, but Kyle really exceeded all her expectations. Teacher Frey, watching Kale, who looked a little upset, smiled to herself. Meanwhile, the teacher Regier has already contacted the central office to achieve immediate export of children to a safe place. But the teacher Reggae interrupted the teacher Freya, asking him to stop. After that, Freya noted that children should discuss everything themselves, and why not? The region teacher looked at Freya in surprise, asking her a question. The Freya teacher continued, noting that there were so many surprises during this extracurricular class, and the battle was also unfortunately not able to preserve. Therefore, today's lesson will not be enrolled. Everyone was looking at the Frey teacher. Delia, with an annoyed curiosity, exclaimed that Kyle and Sykes won the boss themselves. Teacher Frey nodded, emphasizing that she understood, and added that all teachers were responsible for it. Teacher Reagan. Having listened to her words, she suddenly ordered the staff to start evacuation immediately. She stopped the Land, contacting the teacher. But suddenly, the teacher Reagan added that Kyle, Sykes, December, and Katie still remain in Class F without evacuation. Everyone looked at him in surprise without finding words. Teacher Reagan scratched his head irritated and asked if they were satisfied. But then Frey, pointing to the teacher, added that there should necessarily be a mentor. After that, Kyle gladly turned to Sykes, inviting him to release on his shoulder. Sykes replied with carelessness that he did not need it. Kyle stated persistently that it was necessary, after which Sykes, having hopelessly surrendered, agreed, they say, let it be the way Kyle descends. Give Frey a smile when she hears their small controversy. Then Kyle turned to all his friends and, leaving his shoulder on the spears, announced that they were all returning. Delia and Katie stood joyfully. In vividly discussing all his adventures, Kyle and his friends returned to their academy in an exalted mood. Already in the evening at the academy, Kyle mentioned the words of teacher Frey, who asked him to pay attention to the director because he wanted to understand all the details. Dressing a brand new academic costume, Kyle went to the director's office. Kyle stood at the door of the office with a handle in his hands, thinking that the director was the most gifted personality at the academy. He wanted to understand what a person he is. Kyle knocked on the door, waiting for answers from the director. When the director from the inside invited Kyle to go, he politely entered the office. Before him sat the old with long white hair and beard. The director politely congratulated him and invited him. He was called Tartary Iliad, and he owned 3 elements: water, earth, and wind. Introducing himself, Tartary noted that he was holding the position of director of this academy. The director asked Kyle to sit on a chair. Kyle slowly approached him and sat down. The director apologized for straightness and noted that Kyle is probably already guessing what it would be about. The director, looking closely at Kyle, asked how he managed to overcome all these monsters. He also stressed that the one who caused the mold was a man in the cloak and asked Kyle to tell everything in the smallest details. At first, Kyle stuttered a little and thought with an uncertain smile how best to answer. Inside, he confessed to himself that hiding the magic of light is very difficult. They became an unbearable burden for him. The director wondered if there was something special there. Kyle shook his head, denying and claiming that it was not at all. But suddenly a teacher, named Milna, appeared at the door. She turned to Kyle, assuring him that he should not hide anything from her. Kyle could not restrain her as she suddenly appeared, calling her name. Milna's teacher smiled lightly and replied that she had long been seen with Kyle. The guy, filled with surprise, asked what occasion she visited the academy. When the director answered, he stood up for Milne teacher and told Kyle that she was his longtime friend, and told him a lot of interesting things about him. Teacher Milne stood next to the director's table, watching Kyle. The director of the academy added that Keely Flufield was the only student of teacher Milne. Kyle was quite surprised to find out that his teacher and director of the academy were familiar. Sighing with relief and holding his hand on his chest, Kyle noted that they had to be warned. Milna's teacher looked at him with a smile and noted that she would not meet him then. Recovering her question, Kyle asked the teacher Milna to clarify what she had forgotten at the academy and for what reason she was here. The teacher Milna replied that she wanted to reveal one of the secrets of the seal of this academy. Kyle asked her about the seal. Teacher Milna replied that she appeared in the academy for the sake of investigation, and the last incident finally confirmed her fears. Kyle looked at her in surprise, listening to her words carefully. Teacher Milna explained that that is why she wanted to instruct Kyle to investigate, calling it her order. However, shaking her head, she corrected, "It is not an order, but a personal request." Deep under the academy, the terrifying creature was locked in a giant black cocoon hanging from the ceiling. He was once a dragon, and they say that he burned everyone who dared to meet him. Kyle still could not come to his senses after a surprise to ask Milne's teacher about a dragon guarded at the academy. At first, Milne's teacher did not know what to answer, but in a moment she explained that, in addition to all this, there was something else about the seal, and it was the entrance to the printing house in Class F. Kyle stirred his mouth, not finding words from surprise. He was enthusiastically addressed to Teacher Milne, trying to get a confirmation again about the passage to the seal in Class F. Teacher Milne assured him that all the said reality. Milne's teacher also noted that the academy building covers powerful magic, so it is impossible to rebuild it. Kale, understanding everything, loudly stated that it was because of this that the building was in such a neglected state, and suggested that it was one of the ways of making Class F. Milne's teacher turned her gaze, touching her chin, and thoughtfully said that if you think well. The leader, who all this time was quietly sitting at his desk, listening carefully to everyone, raised his voice and noted that they had one problem. The director noted that first of all, you need to find the entrance to the printing house. Kyle asked him in surprise if he really did not know where the entrance was. The teacher Milne answered the director, explaining that the seal is a powerful source of magical power, and the building itself was shrouded in a powerful magic field. Milne's teacher added that two sources of magic are superimposed on one another, and the entrance to the seal constantly changes its location. Again, plunging into thought, Milne's teacher noted that the entrance was probably sealed. Kyle, returning to Milne's teacher, wondered if this dragon was really so powerful. Milne's teacher told him that according to legend, the dragon is extremely powerful. However, when she saw him, he was occupied by Mayams. At that moment, the director assured Kyle that he would not worry because he was in custody. Even in the worst case, these shackles can weaken, so you need to know for sure how they keep. Kyle thought about the ever-changing entrance, and also over a powerful dragon that is dormant in the dungeon. The director looked at Kyle with a close look and, emphasizing his status as a single student in Milne, suddenly asked if he did not doubt his strength. Kyle, thinking about the entrance and the dragon all this time, literally rushed from enthusiasm. It seemed surprisingly interesting. Read up with excitement and smiling widely, Kyle with his eyes stated that this task could be safely left on him. The director was extremely surprised by Kyle's reaction, while Milne's teacher, as if anticipating such a development, smiled with the boy. After thinking, the director agreed with Kyle and stated that he would manage this investigation. Kyle responded with enthusiasm to the director's words, without resting and shouting loudly. The director of the academy appealed to all present to return to the main question. Kyle, leaning his head a little, looked at the director with interest, asking what topic it was about. The director reported that it was today an extracurricular event and decided to contact Kyle about it. Remembering the main topic, Kyle scratched the back of his back, recognizing what he remembers. The director asked Kyle in a calm voice to tell him everything that had happened without hiding. Kyle agreed without hesitation and began his story about the events in extracurricular activities. But shortly after Kyle's story, the director, realizing the whole situation, made a list of all dangerous moments related to horrible monsters. A man in a cloak and Lichkin are a special threat. The director thought for a moment, bowing his head on his hands. Teacher Milne cast her gaze on the director and asked about the Tartarist. After a short pause, the director turned to Kyle, attracting his attention. He thanked him as a representative of the academy and expressed gratitude for the rescue of the institution from the disaster. The director tilted his head in front of Kyle as a sign of gratitude. At this point, feeling inconvenience, Kyle waved his hands, asking the leader not to lean before him. The director, holding on to his dizzy head, praised Kyle for his excellent work and added that he had nothing left to bow his empty head in gratitude. After that, the director asked Milna teacher to find out what could please Kale. After all, he also deserved a reward. After a short pause and reflections, Milna's teacher went closer to the director, leaned to him and covering her mouth with her palms, whispered something in her ear. Hearing her words, the director was at once surprised that he suddenly understood the essence of Milna. And then, given the deep seriousness, he reported that I, Tartarist Ilias, director of the Magical Academy, I gave Kyle the opportunity to make one that desire. After that, the director laughed, noting that it was a strange award. He addressed Kyle and wondered if he really wanted to get it, and urged not to be afraid. At first, Kyle looked at the director thoughtfully, and then nodded as a sign of consent. Kyle, with passion in his eyes, answered the director with incredible enthusiasm, assuring that he would certainly take advantage of this when the right moment would come. The director, looking carefully at the young man, thought what exactly he would ask when the time would come. Then the director informed Kyle that tomorrow he would introduce him to the teacher who would help him with the development of printing. It will be useful for Kyle. Kyle agreed, thanked, and said he would return to his room. Leaving the director's office, Kale was accompanied by a teacher, Milna, who stood near the door. At this point, the Ruga teacher stood around the corner in front of the office, watching closely in the shadows of what was happening near the director's office. The Submalinus teacher paid attention to him, although she did not show it. The girl tried to act as invisible as possible. Meanwhile, Kyle, full of good mood, visited the hostel room, where he welcomed with all his friends. Sykes, Delia, and Katie were quite excited, waiting for the appearance of Kyle. Delia could not hide her nervousness, and asked Kyle the first reason that forced the director to call him to her office. Katie joined the conversation, asking if the director did not express his dissatisfaction. Kyle reassured them, assuring that he was fine with him and no problems. Then Sykes approached him and asked what he was talking about, saying that something had happened there. Kyle intended to answer, but he was interrupted by Caliur and Garden, who came from behind. Kyle and Sykes focused on them, anticipating the questions. Calbera and Garden calmly and with great pride apologized for the unforeseen invasion and congratulated the audience. At this point, Sykes, covering Kyle with his body, annoyedly questioned Calbury and Garden. Kyle, who stood behind him, called Six, trying to reassure him. And then Caliora, remembering those giant creatures in the forest, turned to Kyle and Six, wondered if they were able to defeat those black monsters. Kyle calmly answered them that he and Six had won the monsters one-on-one. Hearing his words, Calber and Garden were so surprised that they widely opened their mouths and looked at Kyle and Six. Garden just burst out of curiosity. He did not resist, and asked Kale and Sykes with distrust whether they were really serious about it and how they managed to do so. On this, Kalduri annoyedly ordered Gardnu to silence. It was then that all other students in the hostel noticed their conversations and began to watch. At this point, Gardner addressed them with a question of whether it was true, because other students had already discussed this topic. Suddenly, Kelior worshipped with Kale and Sykes, sincerely thanking them for their saved life. Garden and other students were stuck, looking at Celior in surprise, not knowing how to respond to this scene. After performing a respectful bow, Caldura straightened and said that he knew how they not only saved him, but also contributed to the evacuation of others. All students watched them silently, waiting for the following words. Kalora dropped his head with humility, contacting Kyle and his friends asking for forgiveness for his rudeness. Sincerely regretting what happened, Kalura invited Garden, demanding an apology. However, Garden was just annoyed with the nape of the head, saying that he was so knowing everything. Suddenly and loudly, he expressed his sincere words of thanks to Kyle and his friends for salvation. Kyle, Sykes, Dilia, and Katie stood stunned, not believing in their ears. Lifting his voice and smiling widely, Kyle turned to everyone, spreading his hands as if he wanted to hug them. He assured that they should not worry because they are all students of the same academy, and that it is quite natural to help each other. Kalura and Garland did not expect such a reaction from Kyle, and they were overwhelmed by the inconvenient feelings because of the good words spoken by him. Instead, Dilly and Katie rejoiced that everything was like that, and fully supported Kyle's words. Kyle Dia, glowing with his smile, looked at all present, sharing his joyful mood with them. However, without holding back his passion to find out more, Garden asked Kyle how they managed to overcome those monsters. Kale, having fun with his fists, answered the garden that hit her hard. Sykes, who was quietly standing nearby, also noted the garden that he had spun them, and everything was simple. The balcony struck that Kyle and Sykes answered him in a similar way, so he asked them to detail their response. However, this only caused a loud regat among all students in the hostel, who could not restrain the laughter from the answers of Kyle and Sykes, as well as how the balcony reacted. So I happily thought what a luck, and I said that everyone would now be able to live in peace and harmony. While everyone gathered in the general hall of the dormitory and passed the topic fervently, the Turk remained in the shadow behind the door, reflecting them through unconcealed anger. Garden and Sykes were victorious with black monsters lively. Watching them, the Turk gleamed his teeth and, without standing, left the room. At this time, the director of the academy went to the balcony of his office, thinking about Kyle. His thoughts were full of expectations. The guy was extremely interesting, and the great future, no doubt, was waiting for him. The director noted with sadness that there was no other teacher for Kyle, and hoped that the appointed teacher would be able to cope with this task. At the same time, work on various chemicals that created the fog around the room was boiling at the academy's research tower. The tower entered a girl with a long black braid. Her name was Alicia. She turned to Lady Riley and looked at the room, restlessly remarked to the professor that she left the mess again. Alicia looked at Mrs. Relisha with surprise and noted that she had to be cleaning her constantly. The girl asked the professor of the Relay to start ordering on her own. With a crazy smile, Professor Rolish, ignoring all the previous words, happily told Alicia that he had come on time. She also enthusiastically told Eliza that she managed to open a new combination. At that time, Eliza collected books and records from the floor. Hearing what she had just sounded, she looked at Mrs. Relisha with surprise. Professor Relisha, like a real chemist genius, commented on it, laughing. It is probably a sign of fate. Ms. Rolish looked at the little bottles carefully, lifting them in the light. Her eyes radiated the delight, and she confessed that she had a premonition. Something incredible would happen soon. Eliza stood nearby, puzzled and not understanding what it was. The next morning, Delia, while in Class F building, asked Kaylee with surprise about the secret seal of the academy. Kyle confirmed this information, adding that his teacher was familiar with the director of the institution. And yesterday they asked him to check the seal. Delia smiled clumsily, addressing Kyle, noting that it was difficult for him to imagine how the director personally asked Kaylee. In response, Kyle just smiled easily, agreeing with her. Then Kyle turned to his friends and suddenly asked if they were ready to come to the rescue, to which Delia and Katie were staring at Kyle. He, in his turn, joyfully spread his hands and, smiling, invited everyone to unravel the secret of the academy. The Psyche, the Land, and Katie looked at him and kept silence. After a few moments, the Land was enthusiastically suggested that they would join him too, what Kyle agreed. And the Land, anxious, asked it quietly if it was too risky. At that moment, all four stood under the dome that protected them from unwanted ears and eyes in the classroom. The thoughtful Kyle told everyone that according to the director, the seal turned into a maze where monsters could hide. And at the very end, the dragon was closed. With every word heard, Delius's face was covered by fear. However, having distracting friends from their alarm, Kyle smiled happily, assuring that there was nothing to worry about. Delia wondered with excitement whether it was so unjustified to think. However, when answering it, Sykes said Kyle that he had no objection, and looked closely at him. Sia, with a serious expression of the face, noted that he felt as he became stronger after the battle in the forest. Squeezing his fists and looking at them carefully, he added that he seeks to test himself in a new confrontation. Looking at Delia and Kita, Sykes noted that they have also passed through a deadly test, so they can be a little more confident in their abilities. Katie, with enthusiasm, shared the news that fears to interfere, but if Kyle wants, she will gladly go with him. Delia, nervously scratching his head and stuttering, stated that he was also ready to join. Kyle literally glowed with joy as he joyfully told everyone that their team of detectives was collected. Everyone looked at Kyle with alert, unanimously agreeing with him. Suddenly, Kyle noticed someone outside the sound insulation barrier. He stopped his gaze on a girl with a ponytail who said something to them from the protective dome, expanding the boundaries of his barrier. Kyle dropped her inside and politely asked what had happened. It was Eliza. After she overcame the barrier, she gladly noted that Kyle finally paid attention to her, because she tried so long to get rid of them for so long. Kyle was inconveniently scratching the back of the head, and, staring in front of Alice, confessed that they had a secret meeting. Eliza was amazed and asked about this mysterious meeting. Ellis, thinking deeply, suggested that it was actually related to the secrecy of the academy. Kyle had an impression on her words, and he did not find what to answer. Eliza met everyone with a friendly smile, noting that she is a third-year student. She explained that she had come with a message from Professor Alchemy, Relisha, and Neve. Eliza turned to Kyle, asking if she recalled that her name was that. Kyle agreed, and Eliza said with a smile that the professor was waiting for him in the research tower. Then she asked if Kyle would like to go with her. Remembering the words of the director, Kyle said he had instructed to present him to the teacher. When Eliza asked the question, Kyle nodded, agreeing. Satisfied with the answer, Eliza suggested that he follow her. Once Eliza began to lead Kyle to the professor, his friends immediately joined them, going behind. Eliza did not expect such developments and turned to everyone in surprise without understanding the situation. She asked if they were gathering with her, which Kyle calmly confirmed and added that she had already asked them for them, and now asked for permission from Eliza. The agreement forced Eliza to think about Kyle's proposal. However, without hesitation, she made a decision that would determine their future and agreed to the proposal. This is incredibly pleased with Kyle. Eliza, looking at Kyle, added that such things were not worried about such things. Moreover, perhaps it will even bring him joy. Eliza gladly urged everyone to follow her, to which Kyle with sincerity and gratitude answered. Soon Bells, Kyle and his friends reached the research tower. From the outside, it was flavored with white and impressive high. Numerous pipes were visible near the tower through which smoke came out in the street. Sykes, without losing rest, directed his gaze on the high tower and asked if it was a research structure. Delia also lifted her eyes up, noting that she had not known before the existence of such a place in the Hague Academy. Meanwhile, Kyle and Katie also looked at the tower heights. Eliza entered the door of the research tower and reported that almost no freshman was here. Behind her followed Kyle, Sykes, Delia, and Katie. Passing the tower, they stopped their gaze on the winding ladder, rising up the meter by meter. Kyle looked at this endless number of steps and delighted in Delia. Delia, in turn, asked if they really needed to climb these stairs. Eliza, standing on the first stairs, assured everyone that you should not worry, because the invisible force would lift them to the top. Kyle first rushed to catch up with Eliza, and climbing the stairs with her, waving his friends with his hand, urging to follow them. All this was a great pleasure. Delia looked at Kyle in surprise and wondered how he managed to get there. At this point, Katie went down the stairs, noting that it is really convenient. Sykes walked silently behind her, and Delia, not waiting for it, stared at them and asked everyone to wait for him. It was at the moment when Delia was about to step for the first east. He suddenly began to shake dangerously, and the rest almost lost his balance. Fortunately, the railing of the stairs kept them. The land, which was eager to rise, felt a lot of fear when it was time to descend. When the trick subsided, Kyle asked Ellis, who stood before him, whether it was an earthquake. Eliza did not respond immediately, but then turned, smiled at others and assured them that everything was fine because she realized what was. Suddenly, Eliza raised his voice to heaven, shouting Professor Alicia. She had to call her immediately and introduce her friends. Eliza called Professor Alice and ran up rapidly. When she opened the door to the office, a room filled with fog appeared in front of her. Squeezing him with her hand, Eliza asked, dissatisfied, whether the experiment of Professor Alicia did not succeed again. Eliza went to the back corner of the room where the veil of fog hung, and with a scope opened the window to ventilate the room. Her gaze met with Professor Alicia, who stood near, and reminded with his dissatisfied look that she asked Eliza to do nothing without her. Professor Rolish coughed through a thick fog, feeling tired. She was sitting on the floor, and sadly told about her confidence in this year's success. There was an element of water in the hands of the professor. When the fog in the room dispelled, Eliza looked around and noticed a mess again in her office. Holding her head, she spoke to Professor Alicia that the mess had caught her up again, and reported to the religion that guests were waiting for them. Professor Alicia, completely ignoring the hysteria of Eliza and correcting glasses, wondered with amazement of which Eliza speaks of the guests. At this point, Kyle, Sykes, Delia, and Katie came to their office. Seeing them, Professor Relishna smiled in surprise and asked that it was this group of students who was doing here. Eliza was amazed at the heart of the professor's questions. She reminded with great excitement and nervousness that the director handed her a piece of paper, which stated that students should come today. Eliza, with a touch of hysteria, asked Professor Alicia whether she had not forgotten and about it. Initially, Professor Alicia did not know what to answer and began to mimic, remembering the words of Elisa. The professor bowed her head before Eliza, apologizing and confessing that she completely forgot about it. Eliza, feeling the growing excitement from this gesture, began to actively wave her hands, persuading her to stop, because she felt that she was turning into a dictator. Professor Alicia straightened and asked Alice whether she was not a real tyrant. Eliza shouted loudly, insisting to stop. Returning to Kyle and his friends, Eliza, a little awkwardly, said that she would handle her cleaning herself, and asked them to wait outside. At this point, Kyle pulled out his small wooden wand and offered his help. Washing a magic wand, Kyle gathered all the books that were lying on the floor and carefully put them in a stack. Eliza and Professor Alicia were amazed by his abilities and could not take his view from this spectacle. Kyle ordered the books to take their seats on the shelves. This order was able to lift them into the air, and they went to their seats. At that moment, Katie noticed something broken and called Kyle, saying that there was a damaged thing. Kyle immediately paid attention to her, thanked her for his help, and gathered all the debris. Professor Alicia, while adjusting the glasses, watched with surprise how Kyle put everything in place. Eliza, no less surprised by his abilities, asked the professors what was happening in general. After the cleaning, Kyle and Katie got up in the center of the shining cleanliness of the room, and, smiling happy, announced that the work was done. Eliza began to admire Kaylee, noting that she had never met such striking magic of victory before. She then paid attention to Professor Alicia, who stood nearby, silently bowing her head. Professor Alicia suddenly jumped out of place and hurried to Kyle. She hugged him with delight, shouting that he was really incredible. Alicia began to fall asleep by Kyle with questions. In what class he studied, or only the wind magic had mastered, and where did he learn how to use magic so skillfully? Eliza resolutely took Professor Rolish from Kyle, strongly advising to stay at a distance. Meanwhile, Professor Rolish did not stop asking Kyle about his magical abilities, constantly insisting that he showed her spells and told her. As soon as the Professor Rolish managed to calm down, she apologized to Kyle. She was surprised from the course, so she reacted so sharply. The professor also expressed his hope that Kyle would not keep her image. On the contrary, Kyle gladly replied to the professor that when you are interested in something, it is difficult to hold back himself, and he understood that feeling perfectly. Professor Alicia agreed with him, noting that this is really the case, and they will be able to find a common language. Delia, watching them, thought that they were both from one link. Kyle introduced himself, clarifying that he was from Class and F, and expressed his hope that Professor Alicia would be able to help him with the investigation. The professor scratched her head, looking at Kyle in surprise, and suddenly asked him about the nature of this investigation. Kyle answered the professor a little awkward about the dragon's seal. From the feeling of awkwardness, he even covered his face with his hands. Hearing Kyle's words, Professor Alicia began to turn the books with unexpected perseverance, looking for the information they need. Eliza addressed the professor, reminding that Kyle had recently collected everyone. Meanwhile, Kyle only watched Alicia's unexpected reaction. Professor Alicia got several books, explaining that the seal of the dragon is the oldest secret of this academy. Aroused by looking at Kyle, she invited him to join the puzzle that absorbed her whole life. Kyle confirmed her question with consent. The professor thought for a short time, without saying words. Finally, Professor Alicia, with a serious facial expression, noted that it was wonderful. She promised to share everything she knew. In return, Professor Alicia, with a wicked smile, asked Kyle to tell her everything he knows. Kyle and all his friends only looked at the professor, full of surprise. Looking at the Professor Rolish, Eliza turned to her. At this point, someone was standing behind the door and listening to their conversation. Last night, before the teacher left, Milna, the director, and Milna gathered on a balcony, protected by a sound insulation partition. It was the director who began the conversation, announcing that the great darkness had already made the move. Milno, looking at the director with a serious look, confessed that she was disturbed by this man in the cloak and that the situation was much more serious than she had at first. She also added that spies operate at the academy. The director reacted seriously and calmly to her question, saying that they only have to guess what they were trying to achieve. He then added that those who see this opportunity will certainly take advantage of it. but this investigation will be an extremely dangerous mission. Milna supported the director's words, noting that it was really dangerous. The director looked at her in surprise. However, Milna continued, adding that if she could not cope, he was only able to do so. So she asked to trust him. Kyle is the only Milna student for all times of her long life that he is able to possess all the elements. Professor Alicia, amazed at a surprise, shouted, asking Kaylee if the entrance to the seal is in Class F. Her face spilled a bright excitement from the whole situation. Kyle stopped in front of her and confessed that he was also very surprised. Professor Alicia, returning her back to them, went away, thinking that this really only a class teacher had the right to go there, and students from other classes were strictly forbidden. Unexpectedly for all, Professor Alicia again plunged into her records and books, already calling Eliza and reporting that it was time for the same artifact. Eliza was amazed by the professor's words, did not believe her at first, and began to ask about this artifact. Then Professor Alicia, having removed his glasses and put on another couple, confirmed the words of Eliza, saying that it was their main trump card in search of the seal. The girl literally shone with joy. Professor Alicia, glowing with delight and showing her glasses, was satisfied that these magical glasses were able to reveal even the most secret mysteries of ancient magic. Eliza, having groaned, looked at the professor and confessed that although she had not seen them for a long time, glasses still fit Professor Alice. They also joined Katie, who was also admired by the professor. Kyle looked at the professor with suspicion and asked how these magic glasses could help them. In response, Professor Alicia laughed cheerfully and explained that these magical glasses allow you to see the magic energy, and thanks to this they will be able to detect the hidden entrance to the seal. Professor Alicia said she had already searched the whole academy in search of him, but could not find, because then she did not know where to look. However, with a glitter in the eyes of excitement, she reported that they are now known where to find it. Holding a laboratory robe and happily calling everyone to follow her, Professor Alicia confidently moved forward, despite his surroundings. Eliza, who followed and worried about her, called the professor, trying to warn the wall standing right before it. But before the professor has warned, the roll was already affected by the forehead against the wall. She just didn't notice her because of her glasses. Elise finished the sentence, noting that the professor never wore such glasses and was always cautious. Kyle, looking at this picture, just smiled. Having taken away from Professor Relicious' magic glasses, Eliza put them on and stated that this role would be her task. Kyle, Delia, and the rest of her determination only pleased. Professor Rolish, wearing her daily glasses, thanked Eliza for her act. Why? Extremely inflammatory, and with confidence she declared everyone about their intention to attend the forbidden class of F. Kyle, nodding as a sign of consent, went with her. Subsequently, everyone gathered near the Class F building and began to carefully search each corner and room in search of a mysterious entrance to the seal. Eliza, wearing glasses, carefully examined all possible places where this hidden entrance could be hidden. Being near Sixa, Eliza reported that there was nothing unusual in everyday places, and suggested Sixa to move further together. Sykes noticed a secret move in the wall, blocked by wooden boxes and tools. He was surprised, finding that in a warehouse behind the wall a hidden passage. After that, pushing all the wooden boxes and tools, the six found a small dark passage. Sykes called Eliza loudly, and she heard his voice immediately hurried to him. Her face clearly expressed anxiety. Sykes stood inside, igniting the fire with magic to illuminate the whole room. Eliza approached her, exploring everything around with magical glasses, and was amazed at what she saw. She immediately called everyone else, asking them to join her. Professor Alicia and Kyle instantly recognized the voice of the Eliza and hurried to it. A closed door appeared in front of Kale, and he was surprised to address the Elise why the door was located here. Eliza noted that these doors lacked both handles and a lock. Professor Rollis was gathered and confidently drew a charming circle on her palm, urging everyone to keep calm. She explained that it was just ordinary magical sealing. The girl was convinced that he could open the door. Professor Rolishi applied spells directly to the door, creating a magical circle. The hero, who was near her, watched her actions with surprise. Both were extremely interested in what would happen next. Only after the magical circle of Professor Rich passed through the door opening the seal, the doors spread themselves. The deed, which ran to them everywhere and was standing side by side, gladly noted that the door had opened. Eliza also joined them, proudly saying that Professor Rolish is a true expert in the magic of seals. Hearing this from Elisa, Kyle and Katie began to get more admired by Professor Rolish. However, Professor Alicia replied with some inconvenience that it was not significant, and asked Kyle and his friends not to praise her. Opening the door, she, glowing with joy, looked at her friends and stated that they would finally find a dragon seal. However, when Professor Alicia opened the door, Eliza noticed something dark, like a clot of black energy. The girl was alert, because it scared her a little. Eliza reacted instantly, resolutely pushing Professor Alicia, keeping her from danger. She used magic, trying to drive it away from the door. The girl was ready for everything to save the professor's life. However, at that moment the door dissolved widely, and Kyle turned to the Elisa, trying to find out what happened. She, however, did not share a word with him. Immediately creating a wind barrier, Eliza protected everyone from black energy. Suddenly, supporting the wind barrier, Eliza began to expectorate blood. However, despite the bloody cough, she made an effort to protect everyone and urged everyone to move away from the door. The courageous girl continued to hold wind protection to defend her comrades. Everyone was amazed by the unexpected cough of Eliza, and Professor Alicia was so frightened that she called her named. Then, Eliza, collecting the blackness of the fog, warned everyone that it was a trap, and the poisonous gas pierced the door. Suddenly, Kyle approached Elisa, who kept the poisonous gas with his barrier, and reported that he had come to the rescue. Eliza was quite surprised by his appearance, and Kyle, meanwhile, used his magic of a wind grid. Thanks to Kyle, the wind barrier became even wider and stronger, forcing the blackness of the poisonous fog to retreat to the door. Then Kyle fashioned a depressing gas, an air dome, and a net that seized and absorbed a black ominous mole. After a few seconds, Kyle forced the poisonous gas to decrease in size. As a result, he held him in his hand, silently hinting that he was able to squeeze all the poison. A small black smoke ball was spinning in Kyle's palms. He warned everyone that it was a dangerous thing and called for it to entrust it. Lisa was amazed by his power so much that she lost the gift of language. Dell and Sykes, behind his back and Eliza, were happily discussing that Kyle, as always, coped on his own. Suddenly, Professor Rolish rushed to Eliza and hugged her firmly. This unexpected gesture surprised Eliza a little. Responding to the arms, she asked the professors of Rolish, or she was not injured. Professor Alicia looked at Eliza with crying eyes and stated that she was indifferent. Instead, noting Eliza coughing with blood, she asked what she was doing. Eliza smiled gently by Professor Alicia and assured that she was all right with her, and it's just a drop of blood. The girl does his best to reassure the teacher and reduce her anxiety. But Professor Alicia, without calming down and holding Eliza firmly by her shoulders, explained to her with a fancy why she was constantly risky because of her. The professor of guilt for everything that has happened is very sharp. Professor Alicia tilted her head, full of sadness, and the extremely dissatisfied Astalicis wondered what would happen if her body was injured. Eliza, looking at her, did not find words, and Jero was silent. The characters were surprised to translate their views from one to the other. Gathering with thoughts, Eliza apologized to Professor Relitius. After that, Professor Relitius also mastered herself, smiled a little, and apologized to the boys, confessing that she had lost her control over herself. The land and Katie, smiling, waving them goodbye, assuring that everything was fine. Looking at them, Kyle could not help but mention Mill's teacher. Kyle approached Elisa and Professor, asking if they were really linking them. The girls fell silent for a moment, looking at him in surprise. Finally, Eliza confessed that it was true. The girl explains that Professor Rolish is both her older sister and mother. Hearing these words, Kyle and his companions cannot hide their genuine surprise. Eliza, with her eyes full of tears, said that Professor Alicia took her to herself when she remained an orphan and constantly cared for her. With a joyful smile, Eliza shared with everyone that Professor Alicia raised her with all his love. So, for her, a professor is an extremely important person. Hearing such words in her head, Professor Rolisha said, looking at Eliza. From these words, she felt a little embarrassment. Hearing the story of Elisa, Delia and Katie did not hold back tears, so strong was their emotion. Kyle and Sykes, stunned by watching it, could not pronounce words. Eliza, noticing that she was exciting her friends, waved her hands awkwardly, hinting that they did not cry. Suddenly, Kyle approached her, asking for her sudden question about their relationship. Eliza only smiled back, assuring that she was not hiding. Suddenly Kyle leaned before Eliza, expressing gratitude for her reaction, through which they were all saved. Friends, recovering from the experience, began to express their gratitude to Eliza for their salvation one by one. The embarrassed Eliza has scattered, assuring that everything was fine, and turned to Professor Alicia in search of her support. A large number of thanks to the girl has a great discomfort. At that moment, the professor hurried to the secret room, carefully studying the stairs that led there. Eliza turned sharply, and noticing the professor, Alicia rushed inside, anxiously exclaimed to her. After that, Kyle and Daly rose to the secret room to look inside. They were incredibly interesting to find out what was hiding behind that mysterious door. Professor Rollis, Kyle and Delia stared at the stairs with interest that they went down. Kyle noted that the stairs seemed very deep, and Delia asked how many degrees there. However, Professor Alicia reassured everyone, assuring that everything is under control. With passion, she announced that new puzzles were waiting for us. In response, the audience exclaimed enthusiastically, expressing their consent. Professor Rollish, with a sublime mood and passion, led everyone forward, saying that you only need to move forward. Dial, watching her, noticed that Kyle and Professor Rollish were actually very similar to each other. At that moment, an unknown pursuer followed them, gaining courage to penetrate into a mysterious room. He did not seek to be noticed, so he carefully kept away from the characters. The door began to slowly close. In the end, the doors are tightly closed, releasing thick dust and steam clubs from under. Our heroes were happy to climb the stairs, looking carefully at all. They were filled with a strong desire to reveal the secret of the academy. When they climbed the stairs to one of the rooms, Professor Alicia and others saw a huge empty space. Delia did not restrain her and asked in surprise that she was a room, and Katie only noted that she was really spacious. Professor Alicia was interested in saying that there should be a hidden passage here. She then added that this place is too huge to look for manually, so she suggested that Eliza use charming glasses. Eliza agreed with the professor and put on her magical glasses. And then I was struck by what I saw through the glasses. Holding her glasses, Eliza reported stunning to everyone that she saw the door. Professor Alicia was surprised at how quickly Eliza was able to find this door. Eliza confirmed her words, and then admired that she was embarrassing something. An expression of surprise appeared on the girl's face. The girl claims that the door is everywhere. Thanks to the magic glasses, Eliza noticed many doors in front of her. Her surprise had no limits. Everyone was amazed and confused when they heard the news from the Eliza. Professor Alicia, without hiding surprise, asked Eliza loudly and with notes of misunderstanding what all that means. Eliza, in response, stretched her magic glasses and urged her to try on her own. Professor Alicia, putting on his glasses on her glasses, was extremely surprised that she had faced her eyes. Eliza waved her hands lively, persistently asking the professor that they were going to do with it. Professor Rollish, the most confusing, did not know what to answer, and eventually stated that the documents indicated only one exit. Eliza and Kyle looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she was in mind. After that, the professor told everyone that only one door was correct. He asked the audience to test all the doors. This statement aroused the Eliza anxiety, and she warned Professor Relishes from careless actions. Suddenly, Professor Relish approached one of the door and opened them to see what was inside. At that moment, the head of the ominous goblin, who shouted in a horrible voice, advanced from the open door. Sweating the monster, Professor Relisha closed the door with a clamp, pressing them with the body. Eliza looked at the professor with her concern on her face, concerned about her condition. Meanwhile, Sykes realized that there were too many problems on them. Sykes tried to grab a sword from the vagina when Kylie unexpectedly destroyed the monster he had not seen, right at the door. At that moment, Sykes was amazed and looked at Kyle in surprise. Then, together with Six, they turned to Kyle, wanting to find out what had just happened. Hearing their question, Kyle turned, but did not find the words to answer. Going to Kyle, Sykes asked him with dissatisfaction with something, but then his gaze accidentally fell on the door. Kyle, feeling uncomfortable under the watchful eye of Sixa, did not know what to answer. Kyle rubbed the nape of his nape, quietly assuring that if he focused, he would be able to see the door. Sykes did not express much surprise, noting that he was expecting such an answer, because it was Kyle. Next to Sixa was a land that was surprised. Sykes reported that they will be able to find the right door faster. However, Kyle, making a thoughtful facial expression, noted that there is one obstacle. He noted that there are no doubt here, more than 1,000 doors. Della was extremely impressed with so much, but the endless height of the door continued to surround the heroes. Sitting on the side, the land began to cry, and assured that if everyone was checking everyone, it would take a lot of time. Then she carefully assumed that the door may have been noticed somehow. Kyle, hearing this hint from Dale, thought for a moment. Kate radiated such joy and support, arguing that this stage can certainly be overcome, and if they make efforts, they will be able to go through it. In the look of the girl, hope glowed. Kyle still reflected the words of Delia and Katie about those mysterious marks on the door that could overcome this stage. After short thought, he suddenly sounded up with the idea. Kyle sincerely expressed his gratitude to all for their proposals. He noted in business and Katie, which thanks to them now knows how to act. However, Delia and Katie only looked at him silently. Kyle recalled that the last one who found the right door was Milna's teacher. Believing in his own strength, he spread his hands and closed his eyes focused, trying to feel the traces of magic left by Milna. Eliza, wearing charming glasses, turned to Kyle. Looking through him, she watched with his emotion as his magic level grows uncontrollably every second. Professor Rolish approached the interested Eliza and wondered what had happened. Alicia, not looking away from Kyle, replied that Kyle's magic enveloped the whole room. Belize was still fascinating with Kaylee, not believing that his magical abilities continue to grow constantly. She could not fit such an incredible force in her head. And in the end, the girl thought, who was this Kyle? He stood there with his eyes closed, immersed in himself. But suddenly his friend managed to open his eyes. Smiling, Kyle declared a joyous news. He found traces of his mentor. Eliza and Professor Alicia looked at Kyle with surprise. Then he clearly replied that he found the right door. With a slight smile, Kyle pointed to some of them, assuring that it was exactly what he needed. Eliza and Professor Alicia immediately directed her eyes in the stated direction and agreed that there was really a door. Kyle, smiling, mentally concise that he found the right door. Kyle glanced at the magic seal on the right door and thanked Milna's teacher for leaving her magic there. Kyle gladly turned to Professor Alicia, saying that the one who found the right door left his signature here, so that in the future it is difficult to find them again. Professor Relash understood him and nodded a little embarrassed. After that, Professor Alicia did not hold back joy, shouting loudly that he was simply incredible and great. In response, Kyle told everyone that he would open the right door now. Kyle opened the right door in front of them and saw the clouds and steep rocks in front of them. After passing through this entrance, everyone was on a high ridge, almost at the level of clouds. All around began to surprise the terrain, admiring its beauty. Delia noted that it was an incredibly beautiful place, and Eliza added that this corner reminded her of a utopia. Various small areas, charged with wind, zippers, and other elements, flew around them. The land paid attention to them and asked Professor Relay what it was. On her question, Professor Relash answered that these are areas that contain different elements. Kate, along with Professor Relicia, was fascinated by the spheres, looking carefully at them. Others also turned down, from which in the Dialians, the knees trembled at such a high altitude. After the examination, everyone slowly began to move forward along the rock. Soon new doors appeared before them. Kyle suggested that it was a door located third from the beginning. Delia confirmed his guesses, agreeing with him. Professor Rolish approached the door, opened them, and noting that if everything in the documents is true, the maze awaits them. At that moment, a giant building with many confusing moves, reminiscent of a maze, suddenly grew out of the open door. Its scale impressed the imagination, because next to it the characters seemed tiny. Professor Alicia turned to everyone carefully and strictly warned that many dangerous monsters could hide here. She stopped for a moment, looking at those who entered. She finished her opinion, noting that those who have gone such a long way were absent here. These words caused a great surprise to Kate, and Delia trembled with fear and distrust. After reassuring all those present, Eliza wore magic glasses and warned them to be more careful. During the conversation, she carefully corrected her magic glasses. At this point, Sykes was busy with a wall, or rather, bricks, while pushing it, because he felt something. Eliza turned to him with anxiety, and Sykes replied that the walls were laid out of marble, so it should help them. Psyche returned to Kyle and wondered that he found it there. Kyle stood at that time, holding the walls with his palms and catching the magic the presence of a monster. After 6, Kyle told him that many monsters were here, but the room is much smaller than the previous one. Eliza, listening to their conversation, was concerned about what they were doing. Closing his eyes, Kyle replied Eliza that they had a plan. Such a statement puzzled Eliza, and she asked what was the plan. The girl was really interested in this situation. Kyle told Ellis that they came here without having all the information needed, but it was possible to confirm the presence of Korn and a monster. Therefore, they have developed a plan to handle it. After Kyle outlined the whole situation, he pointed to one place, claiming that there was a way out there. Elise looked in surprise in the direction he pointed out, while Kyle gave a sign of Sykes to start her work. Sykes calmly agreed, grabbing his sword from the vagina. He took it to himself, closed his eyes, and focused. Eliza, looking at Sykes through her magic glasses, was amazed. The level of Sykes' magic began to grow. Suddenly, Professor Relish embarrassed the unrestrained desire to run up to them to ask Kaylee what they think. But Katie stopped her immediately, grabbing and warning that it was too dangerous. The gaze of relying to the magic of Sykes, which was embodied in the huge, fiery spirit of the dragon, causing it to be genuine surprise. When the Psyk opened his eyes and mastered his magic, he told Kyle that he was ready. Kyle looked at Sayaka with a smile, and said that now, the best moment for their combination of strength is now. Then Sykes and Kyle simultaneously shouted their spells, draining them together. Sykes had a fiery blade, and Kyle had a powerful hurricane. Sykes sent his sword forward with a rack, and Hurricane Kyle increased the power of Sykes thousands of away. Thanks to this powerful combination, they punched the hole in the walls of the maze. Their combined force was incredible. The stones flew on all sides of their actions. The stream of the magician resembled a hurricane. At this point, everyone looked at them in surprise and silently admired their power. When the spell lost its strength, the smoke was slowly scattered, and Kyle and Sykes appeared on the eyes of the audience. Kyle pointed through the walls, inviting everyone to go for the next test. Eliza was delighted with the incredible power of this combination, and Professor Relish, watching Kale and Sykes, was amazed, a magic she had never seen before. Meanwhile, Kyle and Sykes were sharing joy, greeting each other with high heels in the sign of spell success. Meanwhile, a small earthquake occurred in the deepest bowels of this seal, thanks to the strong spell of Kyle and Sykes. It led to various cracks on the walls and columns. The black and gloomy seal of the dragon, located in the center of the room, shook and began to produce dark energy, from which the dragon that had been rested under the seal for a long time. All present went through the hole in the wall, overcoming the maze. Professor Alicia happily stated that they had successfully coped with the maze, and added that this method was very difficult. Kyle returned to Sykes and winked him, noting that they worked great. Sykes answered Kyle with a light smile, saying that he simply followed his plan. He did not even suspect that the wind of Kyle could strengthen his flames. Katie, watching Kyle and Sykes, remembered how Kyle once said they would solve this mystery together, and Sykes asked them if they had already survived a deadly clash. Katie was increasingly disappointed in their abilities. She considered what actions it should be taken, because if everything continues as it is, it would only interfere with others. Suddenly, a powerful flurry rose before Kyle, Sykes, and Eliza. They watched in surprise how a large hurricane was formed in front of them. Professor Relicia did not intend to ask if it was another test. Delea barely kept on his feet, clutching Kaylee, saying that he was about to take his wind. Kyle, on the contrary, watched a hurricane with interest and did not move. Next to them, covering his face from the wind, stood Sykes, who noted that something special was felt in this wind. Professor Relish, watching Eliza, was convinced that the document mentioned that this place was indicated as an elementary zone. She noticed herself that only the wind prevailed here, and offered to rename it to the tornado zone. Delia expressed dissatisfaction, noting that further movement was impossible. Kyle took a step forward, reached out to the tornado, and urged everyone not to panic while staying with him. Alice looked at Kyle with surprise, calling for help. Kyle raised his hand up and applied the windwall spell. Then Delia looked around and noticed that the wind spoke. All the characters looked at Kyle with surprise. The professor of the relic, as always, was fond of Kyle's abilities, and he gladly suggested that everyone move further with him. But suddenly the psychic caused Kyle. Kyle returned to him and asked what had happened. At that moment, an expression of seriousness appeared on the face of the new moon. Then Sykes replied Kyle that, theoretically, the land should be used against the wind. Then Sykes asked Kyle whether he was able to own the magic of the earth. Kyle tightened a little, asking Sykes from where he knows. Sykes explained that the magic that Kyle applied in the forest, or the same spell, the new moon still detained in memory. He explains that it is a spell of a sacred circle, the combination of not only light magic, but also the magic of the earth. Sykes looked at Kyle, asking if it was true. Kyle was very pleased with this, and confirmed all of what was said, noting that psychologists are so intelligent that they understand everything from one view. Katie, who was standing nearby, surprised it, and she wondered if it was true. Katie grabbed her head, mentally complaining about what she did not understand. She considered herself even less useful than she guessed earlier. It seemed that she was always rescued, but in fact, she was only interfering. At this point, Kitty's attention was attracted by Kyle's words, who confessed that he was only using the wind because he promised the teacher. He adds that if this is not an emergency, he has the right to use only the magic of the wind. Without understanding it, Sykes asked about the emergency. Kyle nodded, agreeing, and explained with a smile that an emergency situation was when he protects his friends. Katie deeply stunned the news, causing her to silently. Her face literally emitted the impression of extreme surprise and misunderstanding. Kyle, not noticing any changes, continued to say that this test seems quite interesting to him. Psyche thought about Kyle's words and said quietly under his nose, which was really exciting. And what if he tried to limit himself? Suddenly, at that moment, the dawn of Delia cut the air, pointing something. Eliza, along with Professor Relay, returned towards the source of the sound, unable to grasp what was happening. Then Delia pointed up and noted that small bubbles were circling around them. Everyone lifted their eyes up and saw many bubbles of different sizes that were in the sky. Professor Alicia, in surprise, asking what it can be. Kyle also stood, watching these bubbles with surprise. Kyle noticed that the wind spoke, and quickly shared this news with all. Professor Alicia, a little surprised, asked him if it really was. Professor Alicia, having calmed down a little, lifted her gaze to the sky, lit with a variety of bubbles, and asked everyone what changes they carry. At this point, Eliza, who also looked at the bubbles, suddenly noticed something in the sky. Eliza, a little anxious, called Professor Alicia, asking what was noticeable in the sky. After that, all, together with Professor Alicia, looked at where Eliza pointed out. A huge, dark arm appeared in the sky, rapidly approaching them and radiating the threat. The area was scared of this creepy hand and asked everyone around whether this hand was fiery. Immediately, Professor Alicia realized that the magic of the wind had disappeared, and instead, fiery bubbles appeared. Reflecting on constant changes in the elements, she finally realized the cause of all these transformations. And then Professor Rolish realized that this place was just an elementary area. She was covered with anxiety and panic. She ordered everyone to flee from the dark hand immediately. The black hand from heaven almost reached them, ready to grab everyone. Eliza rushed to a different direction, and Delia, full of tears, ran, not paying attention to where her eyes lead. At that moment, Sykes rushed forward, preparing to grab a sword, and Delia watched him with surprise, at the same time struck by how he disappeared in a distance. Psychiatrically grabbed the sword from the vagina, thinking that to pay the evil for evil is the wrong way. But despite this, he was convinced that he would be able to push the dark hand with his fiery magic. Suddenly, Katie appeared in front of him. The psychic glared at her with a shrunken look, fading halfway. At that moment, Katie took her little magical wooden rod and directed him to a dark arm that was approaching them. Hearing someone calling her by name, she turned to her voice and reported that her element was water. Katie assured Sykes in her ability to cope with the situation and asked him to move away. Sykes shouted at Katie with anxiety, calling her not to do inadvertent actions. He added that, even having an advantage in the elements, the situation is too dangerous and the enemy is too strong. The young man really worried about the girl. Returning his back to the thorns and holding a wooden magic wand, Katie categorically told him that it was necessary. Sykes was genuinely surprised by Katie's words. They were incomprehensible to him. But Katie continued, explaining that she was seeking to protect her friends. She lifted a magic wand, caused a water ball, and moved it straight into a dark, fiery hand.